Where'd it go? Okay. All right. Awesome. I think it's recording. All right. It's to avoid legal snags by telling people they're being recorded. James, you're being recorded.
Oh, thank you.
All right, James. So this is our first podcast together, Pulp Fiction Renaissance. And I appreciate you coming on here and doing this. And I think that I've looked at since I've made the website and you posted it on your website. I've got something like 112 views in a day, which I thought just blew my mind. That's crazy. I know maybe that's not, I don't know, Howden Mifflin, publishing numbers, but to me that's pretty good. I usually stay in the 10 to 12 range of views. 8 of them are mine. So that was pretty fantastic.
When my webmaster first made jamesafon.com, I would check it every day, and I would usually upload like one thing a day, I think, at that point. And sometimes it would take a week for me to get a read on something. Eventually, it's people that had bought my Paladin Press book started searching me, and they started finding it, But it took a long while I was under triple digit total reads for articles for like the first year or two, I think. Yeah, at least the first year. 2011, I was lucky to get more than 100 reads on anything that I posted. And if I posted fiction, it might eventually, after a year or two, get 5 reads. I looked up something. Actually, I looked up my idea way back in 2011, I think, or 2012 for doing some type of new internet pulp fiction.
Yeah.
And I think including your read, after you searched it and found it, I was still under 100 reads. And that's something that was published back in 2011, 2012. So
that's pretty tough. That's a tough. You say the word Pulp Fiction, and people look at you, and they usually say, and I'm sure you've had this happen too. Are you talking about the Quentin Tarantino movie? Yeah, I've heard of the Quentin Tarantino movie. And you say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Quentin Tarantino based his movies off of this genre of literature. And then if you get a guy with some kind of English literature experience or literary criticism experience, then you'll get, well, that's not literature. What are you talking about? And those are the two, you get past those two responses, and then you say, okay, well, how do I explain this?
It's like mentioning Richard Burton, and then people just want to talk about Liz Taylor and, right. When this guy died of liver failure. So it's horrible.
Yeah. No, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And, they probably couldn't tell you that Laurence Olivier was the guy who got Richard Burton, inspired to be a Shakespearean actor, or that he was going to be the best one if he didn't have a drinking problem of his generation. They can't tell you that either. But they can tell you, he might have dated Elizabeth Taylor. Maybe if they're really rock stars, they can say he was an Antony and Cleopatra. I don't know. But, nobody knows who Richard Francis Burton is either. And he's a pretty neat guy. But yeah, nobody knows about that. So that's really, when I found your writing, I had read a lot of your crime stuff and a lot of your urban, tales of urban blight, as you've called it. And then I saw you were doing the Pulp Fiction kind of stuff too. And I thought, well, this is, I've found that, martial arts master living at the top of the mountain, type of deal. So that's all of my interest in one.
You've been I gave up the idea of trying to do like a Pulp Fiction thing on any website probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. I even have a novel that I started serializing with Richard Francis Burton in it, that I started serializing in early 2012 that I still haven't finished because there was just no interest in it. I plan on finishing this year, but you had come up with the idea on your own a couple of years ago, and you were trying to pitch it, right?
Yeah, I was. So I was really interested in having some kind of a database, okay, of Pulp Fiction tropes. And there's a very interesting website. You may have seen it. Maybe some of your other literary-minded readers might have seen it, called tvtropes.com. And they had a whole list of different kind of situations and characters and patterns that occur in these different kinds of stories you'll see in TVs and movies. And there was really a pulp undertone to a lot of them. Unfortunately, the website, if you go to it, is really played for ironic laughs. And I think irony is probably the biggest killer in the artistic community today. And that really bothered me. So I said, what if you could make a website where you have all of these different kinds of things that go into Pulp Fiction, but it's played completely serious. Writers can use it, historians can use it. And I had pitched this to a couple different people in the Conservative Libertarian Fiction Alliance, which operates on MeWe. And they used to be a lot bigger. They used to be on Facebook. Then they migrated to MeWe a couple years ago, like in 2017, way before MeWe was the big thing that it is now that everybody's talking about. So they had lost a lot of readership. And I pitched it to some of those guys. And they said, hey, that's a really cool idea. I don't know if I can, you know, I'd like to see more of it maybe. But it just wasn't generating the kind of, oh, I really get that. I see what you're saying. It just wasn't generating that kind of thing. It would be interested if it came out, but not interested to make it happen. So when I started talking to you about this, and we started talking about a year ago, I think the first time you published a piece I sent you was in, I think it might have been February, maybe January. I sent you a really long piece. And we had started talking, and you had said to me after Christmas, hey, what if we started a Pulp Fiction website? And I said, yes. I have this idea of how we do it, and here we are. Here we are doing it.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you decided that it was something of interest. And what's the name of this alliance?
So it's called the Conservative Libertarian Fiction Alliance, and it is on MeWe. And you can go on there and you can look it up. It's gotten a lot more members since everybody's been leaving Facebook recently. It's ran by, the webmaster is a lady named Marina Fontaine, and there's another one whose name I can't remember. I can see her profile in my mind, but I can't remember her name. There's a lot of science fiction kind of stuff, some fan fiction, not too much. It's the kind of thing you would expect out of a fiction writing group. It's a lot of middle-aged people. There's some young people. They've gotten some more young people. But it's kind of a whole cast and crew of an island of misfit toys. Not nearly as edgy as yours is on jameslafond.com. But you know what? A lot of people that have any kind of artistic inclinations generally fall into the category of lost and drifting souls. So that group fits that bill for certain.
Okay. All right. I never imagined such a thing would exist. I particularly with libertarians, the two books I've read by libertarians, I had a hard time. Anytime I review a book, like right now, somebody's mailed me a copy of Bronze Age Mindset, so I'm working on that.
This is by that Bronze Age pervert guy, right?
Right. Which I can't believe his parents named him Bronze Age pervert. But
imagine he's got to go to the DMV, and he's got to fill out pervert Bronze Age.
Yeah. So this will not be hard to lift a snappy quote from for the title. I try to quote the author of whatever I'm reviewing, find something that's their words, and I use it for the title. I've been doing that since 2012. My webmaster said, you review a lot of weird stuff. So there can't be many people interested in reading anything that you're interested in reading. So to find them, the way the search engines have changed, as long as in the subtitle you have the name of the book and the author of the book, then people searching for reviews will find you. They'll find your article. But I wanted to do something I wanted the main title to be something that the author had written other than the title of the book. Because if it was published by a publishing house, they probably didn't come up with a title anyhow. And I want it to be their words from their writing. So I'll have no problem coming up with a title for Bronze Age Mindset, because the guy has a funny writing style. But the two libertarian books that I reviewed that I can recall reviewing, the one I never could find a I couldn't find a single phrase anywhere in the book that described you. It was just like, I understand these guys understand about economics, and they got some of them have a vague notion of gun rights, even though they subscribe to this insane non-aggression principle. But why don't they have an artistic bone in their body? So it's nice to know. So I have an artist friend that is a libertarian or was. So it's nice to know that he's not the only libertarian with artistic, components out there.
There's maybe 3 or 4 of them. It's pretty good. That's so true. I have never been a libertarian. I never was a libertarian.
I'm not
when I was 13 and 2008 rolled around, 2008 to 2016, and libertarians were just the thing to be if you were not a far left liberal. And I absolutely hated it. My dad hated it. My dad said my dad and I both couldn't decide who we disliked more, libertarians or liberals, for a really long time. And it's interesting. The idea that there are 4 social classes in society is a really good one. You've got your spiritual class, your warrior class, your merchant class, and your worker class. Okay, I'm not going to say bourgeoisie and slave class because that's a little Karl Marx for me. But whatever. It's a different word, means the same thing. And the libertarians, they do not like the warrior class at all. They do not like the idea of it. You summed it up perfectly with the non-aggression principle. They don't like the military. They don't like the police. They like their gun rights, but they don't really want to do anything with it. And they really believe that human nature is a wonderful thing. And, places like Somalia or Baltimore doesn't ever compute into their into their equation, and it's a really bizarre movement. I was happy to see a couple years ago that their convention sizes were dwindling, but that's kind of a petty dig on my part. Unfortunately, now anybody that is slightly right of AOC is all in the same boat. I guess I've got to be friends with libertarians. So James, to your libertarian viewers, that's where I'm at.
Well, it's good to see them involved in fiction because I guess Robert H. Heinlein was regarded as one, and essentially Ayn Rand wrote science fiction, so it's a good place for them. It's a shame because they seem to be far more intelligent than the average bird, but devoted a large portion of their life into such debates as how to privatize the sidewalk. So,
because once you privatize it, those cracks are going to be gone. Don't worry, it's going to magically happen.
It's really and it's probably the place for conservatives to go to, is into writing fiction, because it's the only place where you're going to be able to conserve anything. The engine's kind of geared up the other way. Anything else, you're basically building civic sandcastles. Like if you're a cop arresting people that are committing violence in New York City, these guys are going to be out on the street in 3 hours. It's like the holding time they have. They get to keep this guy for 3 hours. It's just he's getting an extended lunch break and he's getting a free soda food.
Right.
And a free phone call in case the smartphone that he stole, has been deactivated by the service provider. So I think it's a good place for conservative people to do too. I'm neither.
James, I don't know what you are, and I don't know if you can really explain what you are. I think you're James Lafond. That's really the only way to explain it, a Lafondian.
Well, I don't worship, the economic engine of nonviolent prosperity. So I'm not a libertarian. I regard, Western civilization's already dead. Not that I thought it was worth preserving in the first place. It's an interesting boneyard. So there's no way I could be regarded as conservative. Progressivism is just insane. It's the idea that you're going to be able to help everybody out in a nice way, despite the fact that the basis for every one of your initiatives is pointing a gun at somebody's head and telling them to do what you've decided is best for them. So I don't know. What do you have? You have Pol Pot on the left. I mean, who's on the right? Frederick the Great of Prussia. He's cool at least. I could hang out with. I don't think I could. I could probably hang out with Pol Pot, but only if we were drinking and playing cards. Frederick the Great, I could probably even work for. I mean, it seems like that would be the easiest guy. But on the other hand, the poor libertarians that think something like just an economic system could be put into play like a deist worshiping economy, and then you would just have like this benevolent clockwork God that came directly out of economic mechanics. You know what? That's still cooler than being a lefty. Because it's a cozy delusion, and you're not pointing a gun at anybody. So if somebody's deluded, I'll have to pick the guy that's not pointing a gun at me. Okay, and I'll have him go and talk to the guy that wants to point the gun at me. Well, so. So I'm basically an advocate for barbarism.
That's true. You know what? I think that sums it up, and that's a very E. Robert Howard kind of thing to say of you. It's really interesting that we go to this. There's this meme out there, okay, and it says on the top, so you're into politics. Are you a Republican? And it says no. And then the guy says, well, what are you? And there's a picture of Michael Caine in Zulu wearing his British uniform, looking off cheekily into the distance. And that says it all.
That's great. Hey, I did field a political question that I turned into fiction some while back on a Crackpot podcast that it was about the potential candidacy for AOC. And I realized her last name is Cortez, so she's got some conquistador blood in her somewhere. And I find her quite attractive. And when I found out she could dance, that was even better. So I would actually be all in favor of having her as like queen of the world, so long as I was her private advisor. I would spend the nights after she was done with all of her oppressive work and everything. Basically educating her, and I decided that my friends from Baltimore playing dice in the alley would be the judiciary, and I would just ask them what she should do next, and then tell her.
I like that retirement plan. Delegation. They say all great leaders delegate. That's very important.
But yeah, there was a lot of Pulp Fiction. You have a female. You might have a princess. It's very common to have a princess in Pulp Fiction, but you have queens. There, in the Conan stories, there's various women that come from positions of power, like a kidnapped noble girl, the niece of an ostracized nobleman from Zingara. There's a woman that's she's not even a queen. She's the sister of a king who is killed by a sorcerer, and then she's looking for a man to help run her. That was Conan, People of the Black Circle, and she's looking for a man that she's going to one of the generals to try to find a man that can help advise her on avenging the death of her brother. And of course, she gets abducted by Conan because Conan's there to assassinate this guy for having some of his chiefs beheaded for whatever drug running or whatever they were doing. And he finds out that she's kind of special once he hauls her away, and ends up forming an alliance with her. So in Pulp Fiction, there was in Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. There's a smoking hot queen of this wall city. There's people by the knuckle-dragging Neanderthal holdovers from the Atlantean age, and she likes Tarzan.
Yeah.
And she's not like
Tarzan's a
the
pretty cool
ultimate
guy.
bad person. You know, there's other bad actors in the wings, so there's a whole lot of that in Pulp Fiction. So I'm looking forward to after the Secret Service agent who draws a short straw and has to take the pillow to the executive bedroom and end the wheezing of the benighted head of state, and then we could get Queen Caramel Queef in there as like the queen of the empire. Then we're probably going to be in full-on Pulp Fiction mode. So I'm looking forward to it. I was really upset in 2016 when the Gorgon Queen was usurped, when her throne was stolen virtually from underneath her by this dude with this like really ostentatious toupee. So I'm feeling like the world's getting back on the right track. We're open for heroism now because you've got all the opportunities the queenship gives you for heroism opens up and out. But I think that's the lesson of Pulp Fiction from the 20s and 30s is that you're going to have. Interestingly, that's after women's suffrage. That's after 1920 when Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing Tarzan and John Carter of Mars before 1920. But I think Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar was written after 1920, and all of the Conan stuff with all these queens and princesses and everything that really can't exactly manage the reins of power. All that stuff's written after 1920, after these girls got the vote. So, I think maybe Pulp Fiction's coming back into its own. After 1920, Pulp Fiction becomes a thing. There's lots of princesses and queens. My favorite one is the evil winged ebony queen of Almeric. That's from a Robert E. Howard novel that Farnsworth Wright wrote the last 2 chapters of. Kind of like Grace Jones with wings. Okay, if she was Darth Vader, it was just great. That stuff comes in after you basically retool the political system. So all you have to do is terrify women to get them to vote the way you want to vote, and you'll get what you want. And then now, since we're actually going into, since the usurpation has been erased, and we're back on the right track, and we're going to have our own kind of quasi-Victorian age with queens ruling us, Quean. We don't have to go with just a double E. I think this is the perfect time. I think this is why you're here, Richard. Okay.
I think so too. I agree with you 100%. And I'll tell you that, it's very funny. You're 100% right. The conservative movement has abandoned completely any kind of art and literature and anything. And it's really done so in the last 12 years, because you used to have, the conservative movement's changed a lot. When I was younger, you used to have a lot of different things going on in the conservative movement, but there has only been, in my mind, in 30 years, as far as my research has gone, and it's been pretty deep, there's only been one article in regards to heroic fiction and how that influences society and all these different things in a positive way. And that was an article called In Defense of Cowboy Culture. It was published by the Claremont Institute in, I think it was May of 2003. And I'll make sure that I link it here. It's one of my favorite articles because what it does is it says, hey, look, it was right after the great initial victory in Iraq in March of 2003. Things were still that train was still on the rails in that war when this article was published in May 2003. And it said, look, hey, we've seen that Generation X, and to quote the article, is not slouching towards Gomorrah, as was a very famous book in the late 90s. Instead, it's marching to freedom on Highway 1 to Baghdad, marching down Freedom's Highway. And it went into all of the fiction going all the way back to the medieval times, in the Western tradition, what I call it, the Western confrontational warrior culture. And it goes back and it charts the medieval development and then on to the frontier development with James Fenimore Cooper. And then it goes on and touches Pulp Fiction primarily. Oh, who's the guy? The detective, the series about the detective character, Philip Marlowe. And then it goes on into the movies in the 50s and 60s and the 80s, which when this was written was only 20 years ago. And it said, look, America has this great literary heritage, this great warrior literary heritage. And that is the only article or book I have ever seen from a conservative perspective that has ever been written on that in the last 30 years. And really, I can't think of one that's even been written. I really can't think of one that's been written post-World War II. Really, I really can't think of one. I mean, the closest thing I could think of is Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, which was written sometime in the late 50s. And he just trashed what we would call Pulp Fiction as romance. He called it mythos of the summer. And he said, this is just juvenile adolescent daydreaming. This is not serious. We should not take it seriously. And there was a very interesting book written in 1972 by a guy named Will Wright called Six Guns in Society. And it was a structural look at the Western, and it was pretty positive towards Westerns. And that was really the first study of literary criticism that I had read to help me to understand Pulp Fiction more. For our viewers who are listening for the first time, maybe they've read a little bit on their website, what's on there. What is Pulp Fiction? How do you describe it? I'll let you describe it, and then I'll give you my description for people that are brand new and are still, so many minutes in thinking, is he talking about the Quentin Tarantino movie? I don't know.
Well, back to the thing on the fact that amongst conservatives, art was generally pejorative, being artistic, a pejorative that was directed at people on the left.
Yes, yeah.
To me, as a cynical heathen, to me that's just proof of my long-held contention that in this country, knowingly or not, conservatives have just been the controlled opposition of the progressives, whether they know that they're controlled or not. So duping them by essentially invalidating artistic pursuits with a lot of things that have been done on the left. And to start with taking heroism out of fiction, even in conservative fiction, and insisting on this staid realism. This particularly in an era when the individual is becoming less and less important because things are scaling up and gearing up, and you're going from industrial to information age setting. It's the fact that heroic fiction gets stuck in the ghetto, I think, is very important because it's the way. It's just called pulp fiction because they use cheap pulp paper to publish these things. They were cheaply made, and it's apparently for young working class men that are going to read, that are going to be the predominant audience here. So today would be this would be the video game. Right. Is where your audience went. So now that segment of society, your young working class male, he's no longer even a reader. The two guys I'm staying with here, right now I'm living with a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, and they even bought me a case of the beer that I drank and set it out on the porch so I wouldn't have to go inside. Now just leave them alone while they conduct their video games. They're very nice young guys, but so these guys don't even read, even though the one is highly intelligent. He was one of the people that was involved in a recent Wall Street thing. Okay, but so I would say that what Pulp Fiction actually is real mythos. It's real heroic fiction, and that's the reason why it was funneled into the gutter, because it was heroic. Because in the 1920s, that's already post the death of Western Civ. Now you've already gone through World War I. All these nations, great nations, have destroyed each other. basically over squabbles they had over African colonial options and Asiatic colonial options, even though they fought the battle in Europe. They, the educated class almost just wants to be a bunch of vampires. They want to have some spiritual life and this high materialistic intellectual zone. And I really don't think that Bram Stoker's novel in 1901, Dracula, that was probably science fiction that was pointed to 20 years after he wrote it, whether he would know it or not. And he was, that guy was involved in some weird theosophistic cult activity.
Bram Stoker was. Bram Stoker was. That's very interesting, because that's one of my favorite books. I love that book. It probably goes back to being about 8 years old, watching the 2004 Hugh Jackman Van Helsing, and seeing whoever the heck played Dracula with his rock and slick hair and his 3 smoking hot Slavic wives. I thought that would be a pretty good gig. I'd like to get that on my resume, but that's just me.
Well, that I really, if you think about it from the late Victorian, early Edwardian period, coming out of the gaslit era, when you see what happened to society after World War One, Bram Stoker's Dracula does read like science fiction in the period, almost like you could look at Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep, or The Minority Report, or The Adjustment Bureau, written in the 60s, and you can see where there's a lot of parallels now. To what extent that these guys were just grabbing plot devices that they thought were interesting and unconsciously funneling them into the future. I don't know if there was any willful prediction there or not, or if they were just gathering, threads from the subtext of the main society and weaving them into a weird story. And then in the future, it's like, wow, this guy looks like a prophet. I don't know.
That's a good point. Well, I like what you say about that, because to me, Pulp Fiction is essentially the idea of you have these guys, they're in conflict, and somehow they triumph in conflict. Whether they triumph physically and they defeat the bad guy, or whether it's a kind of spiritual triumph where they just go down guns a-blazing, Davy Crockett at the Alamo style, Chinese Gordon at cartoon style. That's the whole point. I recently read a quote by one of the editors of the men's fiction magazines in the 50s and 60s, which is where a lot of the Pulp Fiction migrated to. They ended up calling them the men's fiction magazines. And they said, look, if every literary guy knows it's man versus man, man versus nature, man versus society, whatever. And in our stories, it's essentially built around man triumphing. Triumphing. And so that's something that I think Pulp Fiction is at its core. You have these guys, they're the good guys, they're tough, and they have a lot of dignity no matter what happens to them. And to me, that is the core of Pulp Fiction. And you put them in all kinds of different settings and different kinds of situations, and you get all your different kinds of genres and things that people like, whatever it happens to be you're dealing with in your historical era or in your life. But you take the elements of the hero away, the good guy, he's tough, he's good, he's going to win, or he's going to go down fighting. You take that element away, you don't have Pulp Fiction. If you have that, you have Pulp Fiction, which is the Western North Atlantic warrior mythology in the 19th and 20th century, particularly in the 20s and 30s.
In the 1960s and 70s, that Pulp Fiction was essentially on the spinner racks and on the cheap racks in the bookstores. I used to go to Walden's Books at a mall in Washington, Pennsylvania, and I wouldn't eat my lunch. I got $2.50 a week to get the 50-cent lunch at the cafeteria at Trinity High School. So if I don't eat lunch all week, I can go to the bookstore. It was only a couple miles from where my family lived, and I could get 2 paperback books. Most of the the Conan and the Tarzan books were between $1.25 and $2.25. If it was a $2.25 one, it was usually a thicker one that was a couple hundred pages. The ones for $1.25, would be like maybe 140 pages, little cheap paperback books. And I managed in a couple of years to get a couple hundred of those paperbacks. And my father started buying some of them for me. And I wanted to continue that reading once I started mostly just working to support my family. When I was 19 years old in Baltimore, I started going to the newsstand because they didn't have, the little bookstores had already started to die in the shopping malls, and I was in the city anyhow. I didn't have a car. I would have had to walk like 15 miles to get to a mall. So I went to the newsstand, and all they had was comic books. They didn't have paperbacks, but I did go to the Rite Aid and CVS drugstores, which had extensive bookshelves in them. But now all of the fantasy and science fiction, used to Andre Norton and Hal Clement were classic science fiction writers, and Andre Norton also wrote fantasy, and these books would be no more than 200 pages long. They're short novels. They're not full-length novels, and they're not extended-length novels. These books were no longer out there on the bookshelves. The only slim novels that you could find, you could get at the newsstand. They had the Willie Lamore stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So the only Pulp Fiction I could read now, when I was a young man in the early 1980s, was Willie Lamore, because they were phasing out the Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. The stuff like Alan Burt Ackers wrote like 40 books on the Dre Prescott, it's planetary science fiction. The Hal Clement, Andre Norton, all the old science fiction, Paul, that was all gone, and everything now was like the Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan, where they're all 400-page paperbacks. And you know what? I got through one of them, but this was obviously written for women or emasculated men, because it's all marinated in extended dialogue and feelings and multiple main viewpoint female protagonists. The hero's now always conflicted, and he always has to vet things. So like the hero is not an actionist. He's got to ask permission of the female shaman character to do anything. It's all this drum circle, new age emasculation. And I'm also looking into becoming a writer, and I found out that the publishers did not want a novel that was under 40,000 words. For science fiction, they wanted 80,000 words, because you're supposed to take science fiction and fantasy is included in the publisher definition of science fiction. So for fantasy, it's got to be Tolkien. The whole Robert E. Howard idea is out the window. It's got to be Tolkien or nothing. And they want at least a trilogy, hopefully a tetralogy. They want 4. Okay, the minimum number they'll settle for is 3. The reason for that was economics. They lose money on the first one. They're lucky if they break even on the second one, but they probably still take a bath. They usually, talking about traditional publishers, would make a little bit of money on the third one, and then the fourth one was where the money was. You get people following this series, and what they really want is an endless Danielle Steele series of 400-page paperbacks that goes on for like 30 volumes. Well, this is how women consume literature. So they were retooling for this, and maybe it's because young men and youths were no longer reading anymore. Maybe that's what that was about. But that all went away. Then once I got to the point where I could go to a mall and look for a bookstore, I found that they were gone. In the 1990s, the mall bookstores were gone, and now it was just either a used bookstore or a big mega bookstore. And if you go into Barnes and Nobles, it's the science fiction and the fantasy is dominated by female authors, and the male authors are competing with them to see who can take a short novel and turn it into a bloated novel and make it fat and get it all the way up to like the 700-page paperback limit and turn it into like a mini phone book like that. And that's for a healthy young man, to have to wade through 500 pages to get to the end of the story is just too much.
You had summed up about 10 to 15 years of my life right there. The reason that I stopped writing fiction for a long time was exactly what you're talking about. I'll go back to your original point. I absolutely hate the stuff that you hear in literature. We've got to have character development, and you've got to have character growth. The character's got to change somehow. They've got to have this shadow wound in their life. And that's the only thing that's going to be successful. And I say, listen. 007 is the most successful film franchise of all time. That stuff does not happen. Shit doesn't happen in the originals, which everybody considers to be the best. They've introduced it with Daniel Craig, and people don't like it as much. That's insanity. The only person I've ever found, whether you're writing a how-to guide like for, and I'll use the term that's very politically correct, lay people, because it's not really written for men, it's written for women, a how-to writing guide for lay people, or you're looking at an academic guide for an academic, they're all saying you got to have this character development and change. The only person who does not is a very interesting lady named K.M. Wayland, and she wrote the Reader's Digest. Let me make sure I can get this right. It's the Reader's Digest annotated guide to some kind of Jane Austen novel. I don't know if it was Jane Eyre or Charlotte Bronte or something like that. But she also wrote a lot of kind of like Christian girly historical fiction, right? But she wrote a lot of how-to stuff. And she says, look, you can have your traditional, she calls it a positive character arc, where you have the character change and grow and all this feminine crap. But then you have this thing called the flat character arc, okay, is what she calls it. And notwithstanding that the term is a little bit insulting, because who uses flat as a really good term? But a flat character arc is the hero knows the truth, the lie is outside, and they're fighting the lie outside. It's never within them. They might have a little bit of doubt, okay, just for a second. And one of my favorite examples that you can see that proves that point is, in Dr. No, 1962, the movie, Sean Connery's first 007 movie, he's fighting Joseph Wiseman as Dr. No, and the Bond girl that he's got is Ursula Andress. Right.
I remember that one.
The greatest Bond girl of them all. But they're in there, and they're in his lair, okay, and they're going to go see him. And Ursula Andress tells 007 that she's scared, and 007 says, oh yeah, I am too, don't worry about it. And it's completely deadpan. You're not seeing any sort of fear. I mean, the level of doubt he has, it's so minuscule. It's like smaller than the nail on his pinky finger. And there you go. And that's one of the greatest movies of all time. And, they say you can't do this stuff. So number one, the reason Pulp Fiction's not being written or read anymore is because, like you said, they're not distributing it, number one. Number two, for anybody who's interested in writing it, which is primarily men, they've got the market cornered saying, well, this is how you write. You can't do it this way. And, I mean, that's just insanity. So it doesn't happen. The old stuff gets forgotten, and new stuff doesn't get created. And that's the scam, really.
And they will sell it as an insistence on realism.
Yes, yes.
So if you look at the two venues where I've spent most of my life, well, it's three. Okay, if we look at working in supermarkets, where I've had almost 1,000 coworkers, I spent 38 years working usually two jobs or two shifts in supermarkets, and in one 3-year span, I trained and lost 156 night crew clerks as a night captain. Then there was a couple hundred guys that I trained just as a guy on a night crew because the night captains didn't want to do it. Then there was the 84 guys that I hired and fired when I trained them myself on the night crew as a supermarket manager. This is lots of people. They're all flat character arcs. Okay, these are real people. Okay, the managers are these are people who do not grow. Okay, the managers do not grow. They've gotten to the point where they can the highest point at which they can function in society. The only person that grows is the guy that drops out. Okay, the people that can successfully function in these large organizations, like even a manager that gets promoted out and becomes district manager and eventually CEO, he's just good at backstabbing and ladder climbing. He doesn't grow. I mean, he's always going to be that guy, whether he's a good guy or a bad guy or just this opportunistic, moral vacuum. He's always going to be that guy. And the knuckleheads, for instance, I work with on the night crew, they don't even have the capacity for growth or transformation. These guys, I mean, the managers decided, well, what, growth, transfer? Oh, I mean, I'm actually going to make some money here. Why do I want to mess with that? So, and then the other guys are like, there was like, what do I do now? Somebody has to tell them, and this is, if you're talking about a military adventure, these are your officers and your men. And if there's, the reason why the literary people, and it's the same thing with boxing gyms, the only transformative character is the guy that becomes the coach or the guy that becomes the boxing writer. And if you look at, I was watching Band of Brothers with the Colonel the other day, and that's written from the point of view of a nondescript soldier who's not one of the really good soldiers, and he's watching the acts of these other men, and he's writing about it in retrospect. So where I think that gets in there is not intentionally corrosive, but ultimately corrosive, because the person who tends to write is a transformative character, because he's like Jack London. He was a hobo, okay, getting beat up by cops and wondering if he's going to end up in prison or on a chain gang. And then he becomes a great writer and a famous man. So particularly when English literature in America, when everybody read and you had magazines where Jack London's stories were being serialized in books, the way you made it as a writer was to start out being a working man or something, and then actually transforming yourself and becoming basically a rock star. So the writer was a transformative character, but the normal person is not. The normal person just has a flat arc, whether he's the beta or whether he's the alpha. Most of these people don't grow. The best guy in the gym, you want to talk about a flat character arc, Muhammad Ali, even though he changed his name. That guy never improved, even as a fighter. He's the greatest boxer of the heavyweight division of his age, and he was never even a person who experienced growth as a boxer. He got worse at boxing. He just said, "Oh yeah, I can take a hard punch. I'm not faster than everybody anymore, and they're getting taller, so I'll just rely on getting hit." Okay, so he's like the negative of the transformative character. He's just like going right down into the abyss. So it's plainly not realistic for most humans to be a transformative character. Most humans have a flat arc, whether they're heroic, whether they're managerial, whether they're just whatever class they're in. They're either good at climbing a ladder or they're not. And the person that experiences transformation in the shamanic sense, these are the weirdos and the alienated people that don't fit in. So the only thing you're supposed to write about is the weirdo. And it's, as a weirdo, I resent that. Okay. I'd like to write about, I like to write about a leader every once in a while that's not a weirdo. So I can at least maybe fantasize about being him or some knucklehead that could actually win fights. So it does not have to become a coach and a writer who could just continue being a fighter, That would be great. Wouldn't that be cool?
You know what? It's funny you say that, because that's another complaint that I would always get when I was writing fiction. And it would be from a particular gender demographic. I'm sure you can figure out which one the complaint's going to be from. And this gender demographic would always say to me, so you're clearly writing this great hero, or whatever you're writing about, is you, but better. And I'd say, yeah. Why not? That just kind of goes without saying, doesn't it? Why wouldn't you write about you, but better? And they said, well, you can't do that. Okay, that's called a Mary Sue. And a Mary Sue is unlikable, and you can't say that. And, you know, when you start getting women calling your characters Mary Sues, that's like, you know, they start passing out the yellow stars. You need to sew that on your jacket right there, so everybody knows where you belong. You don't belong here. You know, that's like... And that's what you'd always get. And you talk about the transformative, and this is something I've really thought about over the years. And I have a couple of pieces written on this that I haven't published because I just haven't found the audience, but through the website I think I have. When someone is saying they want a transformative or a positive arc, it is always a tough guy who feels guilty about being tough, and the transformation comes, he becomes super effeminate, okay? He, like you said, there's the female shaman or whatever, and they take a very effeminate spiritual value system, or even, if I may go so far and to sound as Karl Marx, an effeminate bourgeoisie value system, and they just end their warriorhood. Now, if you look at a story, though, okay, so I'm a big, as you know, if any of your readers have read the stuff I put on your website, if you've talked to me, I'm a big fan of John Wayne. He's one of my favorites. If you take a look at any of John Wayne's movies, I'll just use the Sands of Iwo Jima because it's the one that everybody knows, but it's just about every one. There's a transformative element there, okay? There's John Wayne is the father figure, okay? And he's taking some no-name dork beta male loser, and he has got to get him tough. And there's a transformation not in John Wayne. He's already got his act together. He's the flat character arc, but there's this positive transformation in his sidekick. What's really bizarre, though, and I noticed this, you see this change really in 1977 with the original Star Wars, okay? When you are watching a John Wayne movie, or when I'm watching a John Wayne movie, okay, I would argue that everybody from my grandpa's generation is doing the same thing, and I think anybody who knows that generation would too. You are identifying with John Wayne in that movie. Oh, yeah, John Wayne, he's got to train the Marines. That guy's an idiot. What a loser. He thinks he wants to be an artist. He's in the middle of the Pacific. Oh, come on. But there's a moment in the movie, usually when the loser realizes he's been acting like a loser and he needs to get tough like John Wayne, where he realizes he was wrong and then he changes. There's always a little part of me when I'm watching that like, there's a little part of me that's kind of like that loser that you know, I don't like that. So I don't want to be like that. That's like, I'm going to be like John Wayne, okay? And I think a lot of people watching those movies of that generation they were aimed to felt that way too. Now, when you get to Star Wars in 1977, you got Mark Hamill as George Lucas. There is this weird, there's like a fetishization of the rite of passage into warriorhood, okay? Where it's not shameful that he was an idiot before. You kind of romanticize this journey, but you know, he becomes a warrior, sure, okay, he's a Jedi Knight and all that, but he's very, very effeminate. Very effeminate, you know? And that was the whole thing. They don't want to call the movie Revenge of the Jedi. They want to call it Return of the Jedi. And you start getting this very, like, there's almost a postmodern element there, an effeminizing of the hero. And, of course, you talk to any little kid, okay, that watches the originals, and who do they like? They like Han Solo. Harrison Ford is Han Solo because he doesn't do that in the movie. Sure, he gets with Princess Leia, but he's got this classic Pulp Fiction, Conan, John Carter style where he's a flat character arc and just ends up helping out the princess do what she's got to do. He's a security contractor, okay? You don't see that with Luke Skywalker. And it's very interesting to see that Luke Skywalker's Mark Hamill's made the centerpiece of this whole movie, but you see a lot of really young boys especially who are not old enough yet to have completely been brainwashed and bought into this stuff. They instinctually like Han Solo, and you see that all the time. What do you think about that?
Star Wars, I like Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark when it came out.
I think it's a great movie, by the way. I don't mean to knock it.
And they're pulp. They were really the original reboot of the pulp genre into film.
They were.
Okay. Now, I cannot tolerate anything beyond the original Star Wars. Everything, these people were trying to get me to watch The Mandalorian, and it obviously what happened with Star Wars, they saw a cash cow, and then they started treating it like a cycle of vampire novels or something like that. Uh, I, as a teenager, I kind of liked Star Wars. I thought that Raiders of the Lost Ark was a lot better. I didn't like the Han Solo character, and I absolutely could not stand the Mark Hamill character. My favorite character was Darth Vader. Okay, I mean, he's like far and away the best character in the whole thing. And then they waste like 8 more movies on why he's really a woman inside or something, you know.
Right,
so they
exactly.
they take like the one really cool character, which is Darth Vader, which is a great villain. All you have to do is survive against this guy, you know, and it makes your hero stripes, right? But no, now they have to turn him into like this. I can't get through 10 minutes of, and because just about everybody I stay with, they like Star Wars and they watch it. And so I just kind of like leave or wander away after a while. And to a large extent, they just ripped off a whole lot of pulp tropes. And they the saving grace of the original Star Wars is it was just the one movie. Once it became a series, then it really lost the pulp edge. You know, it's just it lost that the grace of the brevity. It just went away, and now it becomes the longer you try to just stretch the story out, just to stretch it out, naturally, the more feminine qualities it's going to take on, because that's the type of fiction that women like. They don't want action; they want a whole bunch of discussion about the action, and they want to frame it and everything. So.
That's a really good point. You know, and you know, it's very bizarre. When I was writing Pulp Fiction and I was coming of age, the idea that this kind of fiction is not realistic always was weird to me, because all of the writers, and I have pointed this out in many venues and will continue to point this out in many more, were World War I veterans, or were in the cavalry and had fought the Indians, or were boxers, or were cowboys at the closing of the frontier. A lot of them were sailors that were operating in the Far East, and some of them had had experience in warlord China at that time. And you're telling me that these are not realistic. But you're also going to tell me the guy with his literary criticism degree, living in his penthouse in New York, he writes the most realistic fiction. Now, how is that? It's like, it's not, the two and two are not syncing together. But, you know, it's very interesting, okay? Because then what you get, usually, once you've got these guys on the ropes with this argument, then you haul out America's great national tragedy, the first time we lost. I think you know where we're going, Vietnam, okay? Because we had to go there. And coincidentally, although not so coincidentally, I think it was meant to be, I was at Barnes & Noble on Friday, and I went there, and I picked up a little book. You probably heard of it. You probably read it. Phillip Caputo, Rumor of War, okay? It's considered the greatest Vietnam memoir of all time, okay? And it's considered an anti-war novel, right, that he wrote about his experiences. Now, it's very interesting because there is a book that was published in 1979. It was a roundtable discussion with Phillip Caputo, James Webb, who was the former, at the time was going to be Secretary of the Navy. He ran for president in 2016 on the Democrat ticket, which was really bizarre. James Webb was a Vietnam veteran. There was a whole bunch of other guys that were either Vietnam veterans on this panel or were in the anti-war movement, okay? And this panel was hosted in 1979 by the Washington Post. And they were going to discuss everything that they had talked about, everything that they did, and what they were thinking about where America was at. Now, Phillip Caputo said, these anti-war protesters came to my house one day, and they knocked on the door, and I answered the door, and they said, "You Phillip Caputo, you're our hero, we love you." And he says, "Well, thank you so much, that's so nice. What can I do for you?" And they said, "Look, we read your book, it's the greatest anti-war book ever written, and we want you to come down to our protests to remove nuclear missiles from somewhere," or whatever anti-war people wanted to do in 1979, okay? And he said, "Hold on, guys, hold on. I don't mean for that book to be an anti-war book, okay? I'm not against fighting wars, period, okay? I'm not against warrior culture. I'm not against any of this stuff. My point of the book was saying, hey, Vietnam was waged pretty poorly. We should really think about how we're going to fight these wars if we're going to get in them at all." And it was just kind of my reflection. He said, I never meant for this to be part of this anti-war canon, and which, if we really, what does it really mean to be part of this anti-war canon? It's this anti-warrior canon, okay? And so this book is considered the greatest book of all time. When you read a lot of literary criticism books about Pulp Fiction, they're always citing Phillip Caputo's Rumor of War as the ultimate nail in the coffin of the John Wayne Pulp Fiction ethos. It's on the Marine Corps reading list. So I got the book, and I read the book, and it's very interesting. I'm going to read you a couple passages, okay? And be forewarned, there will be some expletives for our younger listeners, okay? Here's how the book starts out. Hold on. At the age of 24, I was more prepared for death than I was for life. My first experience of the world outside the classroom had been war. I went straight from school into the Marine Corps, from Shakespeare to the manual of small unit tactics, from the campus to the drill field, and finally Vietnam. I learned the murderous trade at Quantico, Virginia, practiced it in the rice paddies and jungles around Da Nang, and then taught it to others at Camp Geiger, a training base in North Carolina. When my 3-year enlistment expired in 1967, I was almost completely ignorant about the stuff of ordinary life, about marriage, mortgages, and building a career. I had a degree, but no skills. I had never run an office, taught a class, built a bridge, welded, programmed a computer, laid bricks, sold anything, or operated a lathe. But I had acquired some experience in the art of killing. I knew how to face death and how to cause it, with everything on the evolutionary scale of weapons from the knife to the 3.5-inch rocket launcher. The simplest repairs on an automobile engine were beyond me, but I was able to field strip and assemble an M14 rifle blindfolded. I could call in artillery, set up an ambush, rig a booby trap, lead a night raid. Okay. If that does not sound like Pulp Fiction to you, I don't know what Pulp Fiction is. Okay? That, to me, that sounds like Edgar Rice Burroughs writing John Carter. I have always been a strange man. I was always considered young and was always fighting somebody. It sounds just like it. Okay? So why is this considered great literature, but Pulp Fiction is not? And we have established that the authors of both Phillip Caputo's Rumor of War and many of the Pulp Fiction genres were combatants. Now we're going to find out, okay? Hold on. Let me find it. Probably should have bookmarked it before we started recording this, shouldn't I have? So while I look for this, if you want to give your thoughts, hold on.
Sorry for permitting the dead air. Oh.
That's okay. You know what? I thought I'd find it faster than I am. Here we go. Okay. So Phillip Caputo, after being in the jungles of Vietnam, and his guys have been dying, and his guys have been getting wounded, and it's hot, and there's these restrictive rules of engagements, and he's sick of it. He finally gets a victory against the Viet Cong, and he whoops up on them, and he kills a whole bunch of them, and he's very excited. And they've just finished the battle, okay? And a Vietnamese Viet Cong sniper starts shooting. So I'll read from here. The firefight was over, except for a few desultory exchanges, but I did not want it to be over. So when a sniper opened up from a tree line beyond the village, I did something slightly mad. Ordering the platoon to train their rifles on the tree line, I walked up and down the clearing, trying to draw the sniper's fire. When he opens up, every man put 5 rounds rapid into the tree line, I said, walking back and forth and feeling as invulnerable as an Indian wearing his ghost shirt. Nothing happened. I stopped walking and facing the tree line, waved my arms and said, "Come on, Charlie, hit me, you son of a bitch." I yelled at the top of my lungs, "Ho Chi Minh sucks. Fuck communism. Hit me, Charlie." Some of the Marines started laughing, and when I heard one of them mutter, "That stocky little fucker's crazy," I started laughing too. I was crazy. I was soaring high, very high, in a delirium of violence. "Come on, hit me, Charlie," I yelled again, firing a burst in the tree line with my carbine. "You son of a bitch, try and hit me. Fuck Uncle Ho. How do I buy Christmas?" I was John Wayne in the Sands of Iwo Jima. I was Aldo Ray in Battle Cry. And here's the line where you're going to see him get accepted. No, I was a young, somewhat immature officer flying high on an overdose of adrenaline because I had just won a close quarters fight without suffering a casualty. That says it right there. He is accepted as great literature because he apologizes for that. He apologizes. I mean, if this was the Epic of Gilgamesh and Aikido, they scream crap like that all the time. You know?
And in a way, it's taking him out of context too, because there's a more intelligent way he could have approached that, but it's going to, by people who don't have his experience, who aren't in the military, who haven't been in combat, they're just going to latch on that immature statement.
Exactly.
As a instead of immediately their brains going to go. The guy that I was watching Band of Brothers with would constantly make him, "Oh, that's Hollywood. That's Hollywood." I would just call in the 105 millimeters on that guy. There's no way I'd be creeping up that alley. So that was just the response of these people. Like the image of the guy in the New York penthouse with his literary degree. That's the overture of our delusion. If people want to wonder why most of the people in our society believe lies most of the time and reject the actual facts that they see and their own life of experience as somehow anomalous and believe these homogenized lies instead, it's right there. There was the fiction, instead of reflecting the experience of people that read it or the experience of people they talked to, fiction ends up being used to present something that's said to be realistic, but really against realism. And the amongst the World War I combatants that wrote fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien, the Mervyn Peake, who wrote Titus Groan and Gormenghast. It was very Dickensian fantasy, very dark. The Edison, who wrote the book that people think that Tolkien based the Lord of the Rings on. He was a World War I combatant also.
What is it? Is it George MacDonald or George Fraser? I've read some of his stuff.
And then you have C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Who didn't just write the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote many other things too. So that's just one list of Brits that wrote fantasy in the 40s and the 50s that fought in World War I. And Tolkien uses the hobbits as his main character, and they're by definition non-transformative. They're children. They're really metaphorical children that maintain their innocence throughout the whole thing, even into the epilogue. So unless they're acted upon, like the one Bilbo gets acted upon by this ring, but that's not what you're talking about when your literary coach is demanding that you have a protagonist that changes, and preferably changes their nature during the course of an adventure. This is either your nature gets it or it doesn't. Some people might transform their nature during an adventure, and they do, but it's a lot of people don't change and they die, and then other people don't change and they live, and some of them change and live. And I suppose some of them change at the last minute and die. I don't know. I haven't been there to ask any of them.
Well, and in this book, what really hit home for me as I read this book was that, if you go into the old time philosophers, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, the Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, okay, there's two elements of any kind of conflict. There's endurance and daring, or sometimes it's called persistence and resistance, okay? What do you have? You got to put up with crap, okay? And then you start dishing out crap, okay? That's to put it in layman's terms. Endurance and aggression, if we're going to use contemporary terms. And the idea in modern society, when we are writing some kind of a story involving warriors, whether they're fictional, whether they're real memoirs from guys that have been to Vietnam or Iraq and Afghanistan, the main point has always got to be, okay, the aggression has got to be demonized, and it's got to be looked down upon and apologized, which was the passage I just read, and that's what he does. And the endurance, the element that, wow, these guys, you know what, they made it out, it's really tough, okay, it gets pitied, okay? It's pitied. It's not like, yeah, you did it. You showed those mofos. You made it out, and you killed a few of them. That's awesome. You pity the endurance, and you demonize the aggression. And in Pulp Fiction, that is never the case, okay? The aggression is celebrated, and the endurance is celebrated. The warrior experience is celebrated, and it doesn't matter whether you've got the cowboy, he's out there killing the Indians, or the GI killing the Germans or the Japanese, or the spaceman killing whatever alien it is. It's, hey, these guys, this is good. This is good. There's none of this apology kind of a thing. And that really, there was a good friend of mine, is a filmmaker, and his mentor is a fellow named Stan Williams, who is where he was the screenwriter for Will Smith, and he wrote a great book called The Moral Premise. Okay, and he says every story has got to hang on some kind of moral truth, or as he calls it, a moral premise. The whole story is built on it. Okay, and of course, as anyone knows who reads any kind of fiction or looks at the world around them, stories can and morals can be really manipulated into appearing what they're not. And that is the moral premise of a contemporary story. It is about warriors. Like I said, the aggression is demonized, the endurance is pitied. The moral premise of any kind of Pulp Fiction story, going into the 1950s and 60s men's fiction, like I said, they celebrate man triumphing in whatever conflict he's in. It's the aggression is celebrated, the endurance is celebrated. And that's really the difference to my mind as I see it. And I had never seen it so clearly as when I had read this book on Friday.
You mentioned the James Bond character earlier, and to me, that is a way, he's a manipulative playboy, he's a slick guy, he's in a complicated world. To me, to a large degree, that was an attempt to update the hero and place him into a setting that would be essentially bureaucratic and corporate, and would have the villains. You'd have those like really out there villains, but as far as Bond's handlers and his co-workers, and even the guy that played McGarrett on Hawaii Five-0 that ends up meeting him on the island of Dr. No, these different characters that he runs into that are not that main villain, to include the love interests who often work for the villain. That's something that I thought was very well done as a way to try to update the hero for the modern guy that's stuck in some kind of soulless job. For instance, Bond could very much be a metaphor for the guy that works out on the floor who manages to have an affair with the boss's secretary. Okay, with the villain being the boss,
Right.
and MI6, the entity, being like the supervisor or whatever that's out there on the floor. That it gets up. I actually like the Craig version of Bond, but he's not James Bond. Okay, the Craig version of Bond is Jason Bourne. He's a government killer. That's what he is, and that's what the hero is now. The only heroes that are really allowed to go out there and they've got a flat, they're a flat character, and they don't transform, are going to be these almost robotic, psychopathic killers that work for government agencies. Whether they're rogues or not, whether they're working for this agency or that agency. And the reboot of the Killer Elite, that was Clive Owen was in it. Jason Statham. Jason Statham's one of my favorite action hero actors. He's usually some kind of just government killer. Okay,
he kind of looks like a skinnier version of you. Now that I think about it.
So I just the Craig Bond movies, I like them because of the psychopathic violence in it. And the character's just a killer, so that appeals to me. But it really gets away from what the Bond character was, which was a way to make the regular guy in the corporate world from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when all the jobs basically just ate your soul, to make that guy feel like, there's an attempt to kind of, get a little bit of real living in there and do something, maybe minor heroic. Okay. And I really think it tapped into that, particularly with the love interest usually being attached to the evil villain, which to the man of my age and my father's age, and we both like those old James Bond movies a lot, the evil villain's really the boss. That's the guy that runs the company that's eventually going to get rid of you as soon as you hit a certain pay ceiling, and he's just going to screw you over. Like my dad actually got embezzled and ripped off by a succession of 3 different business partners. And the other guy was a senior partner in all 3 cases, and just cast them aside. This is what happens to businessmen that don't come with the daddy's big money, in the modern world. And it's what happens to a managerial class guy. At some point, he gets eaten alive as he starts approaching the top by the guy that's the natural corporate predator, and he just rips his head off. So I think the Bond characters appeal, subconsciously to the man of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think it went there. Then in the 80s and the 90s, it's just like these adventure tropes and everything, and like the guy with the teeth and the hot chicks. And then once you get into the Daniel Craig James Bond, you are just it might as well be the Bourne cycle, right? It's just like the psychopath that's out there breaking some rules, and his handlers aren't quite controlling him well. Now, what I do think could save Bond would be if we could get an African-American James Bond, okay? Because if you think about it, okay, this is the guy, he's the purchaser in every single commercial since America took the knee, okay? He's 13% he's 6% of the population, and he's represented in 100% of the commercial media, okay? He is, he likes his ladies. He's a notorious philanderer. He cares more about how he's dressed, okay, than whether or not he's following the rules. There's a whole lot of things about the James Bond character that work well for the postmodern African-American man, okay? He's not married. He's not Jason Statham trying to get back to his wife, he's kind of morally, it could go either way. He's not even all that concerned about completing his task. He's more concerned about, this Russian babe that he's about to bag. And with the Bond character, it's more of an individual personal animosity between him and the villain. He could care less what his bosses think. He kind of blows them off, and he's always sneaking around the boss. I mean, just about every dude that worked for me in Baltimore when I was a store manager, he was always trying to bang my secretary. Okay, he's always trying to get in her pants. He's always trying to get over on me, even when he's trying to impress me about what a great job he did. So I think this could, Idris Elba or whatever his name is, I think this could save James Bond and return him to kind of being the player. Okay.
I think you're right, and I'll give you an example that it's very funny. If you looked at K.M. Wayland's example that she gave of the flat character arc, okay, it's Gal Gadot and Wonder Woman. And you realize for a moment, you're like, oh, Idris Elba can be Sean Connery. Gal Gadot can be John Wayne. Oh, okay, I see where this is going here. You can put the pieces together, you know. And,
yeah, a man could still be a hero that survives if he is of godly hue. Okay, I think that could work. And if his boss is female,
yeah,
this is important. The thing with the Bond character about the women generally being punished for having sex with him by being killed, that's continued in various iterations of the Bond character. That seems to be kind of timeless. So maybe that will still stick in there. But the idea, if you look at Drive, which is like a really dark, low-key hero movie that's pretty recent.
Is that the one with John Hamm in it? No, I think that's called Baby Driver. Wrong one.
The guy Ron Perlman plays an Old Testament gangster in this movie. There's many movies like this. If you look at the psychopathic hero of a ghostly hue, okay, in most movies post 2000, he dies, or he does not get the girl. So like in Drive, this girl falls for him. Her boyfriend, husband is in jail. Okay. And he ends up basically saving them. Okay. There's a whole bunch of movies like this. The hero in most of your post 2000 action movies that are set in the present, this hero, if he is of European extraction, usually dies, and if he does not die, he returns to his wife, okay, or he does not get the girl. You know, you'll see there's very clear messages. I think this goes to the fact that a lot of these scripts are actually shopped by two chief intelligence agencies in the United States. Heard a great interview with the old Jewish man who took over the franchise of Clancy that wrote like the
Tom Clancy.
Right, Tom Clancy, who was a Baltimorean. Okay, his dad was.
I didn't know that.
Post office. Yeah, he's even was a part owner of the Baltimore Orioles. So this guy was interviewed on No Agenda, and he explained that these two organizations, they're alphabet soup organizations. One of them's supposed to just operate in the U.S. but doesn't. One of them's just supposed to operate overseas but doesn't. They both have script offices. They have script writing offices in Hollywood. Okay, and in New York. And of course, we also know that they have offices in Washington, D.C. They're federal agencies. So a lot of these movies that you'll actually see that are like military adventures or movies about spies and assassins and all, these are actually written by by scriptwriters that work for these federal agencies. There's a novel called Quantico, written by Greg Bear, who is a very excellent science fiction writer. He was given full access to the FBI facility at Quantico, and he wrote a novel about FBI people fighting domestic terrorists. Okay, so this is another one of these approved things. Yeah, he's not a member of the FBI, but his script was okayed by the FBI. There's the wars that are fought by this nation, which are basically managed by these intelligence agencies to a lesser or greater degree, however you want to frame it. They're the pretty invisible bureaucracy that, you know, they enforce a lot of things. They inform the politicians, they enforce the laws, and so on. The people that defend the United States and look out after its international interests, these are almost all Caucasian males, almost all of them. It try to find diversity in the special operations unit. These are the guys that are seeing all of the action. Almost all the combat action is rural, pale-faced guys. I'm staying in a camper where a ranger lives when he's home visiting his family, and I'm right down the road from a guy that was a colonel in the Army Rangers, and I'm in rural America. These people kind of, they fight for a country that seems to dislike them quite a lot, but there still has to be heroic fiction in movie form that's geared towards them. That's going to make them feel heroic. So when you look at like a dozen, just pick a dozen one-off action movies where there's a Caucasian hero in it, he will not get the woman he will not get the girl unless he's going back to be with his wife. Okay, if he's the classic reluctant hero pulled away from the wife, and then he comes back to her at the end of the movie. Okay,
and I'll tell you something.
That's the only one that's permitted.
I'll tell you something else too. His wife is very rarely ever like smoking hot. Okay, she's usually like plain Jane in a t-shirt and some sweatpants, like every time, and it just.
And they're going to. He's either going to go back to his wife, or he's not going to get the girl and go off in the sunset, or he's going to get killed. And more often than not, he gets killed. Okay, right. And there's most of them, they're not sticking in my mind just because they're not that good, but it's a common thing that I see when I'm stuck in front of a TV and the lady has Netflix. Okay, and you can easily watch a half a dozen of these things. So this is very common. So it's, to the extent that the heroic has to be kept alive, it's got to inspire guys that are going to go fight and die for this system.
Right.
But even in there,
but it's got to keep them in their place. Okay. This is like the old, if you ever watched, there's a show, and I only got like through 30 minutes of the first episode. It was called The Jewel and the Crown. It was a British show about the last days of British India. And it was a truly girly soap opera, but I started watching it because, it had some British soldiers in it, and it's British India. Okay. And my favorite character was the bad guy, of course, because he's the only, British warrior in there. He's got to be the bad guy. And, they're doing the ceremony and they're raising the British flag. And he says, it's good that we raise the flag, make the natives remember who owned this country. And, of course, the Indian nationalist who's the love interest of the English girl is rediscovering his Indian roots, and he's sickened by it. But you get a sense where it is, like, kind of reversed, okay? It's like, you're like, okay, yeah, we're going to have the rural, blue-collar, as you called them, pale-hued Americans. They're going to be doing the dirty work, but, they've got to know that they're just merely the sepoys, in our colonial army, shall we say. And it's very interesting you say that, because I have another one of my favorite books. You know that I'm always talking about it. It is called Gunfighter Nation by Richard Barrett. When I read this book for the first time 5 years ago in October of 2015, I knew there was something deeply, deeply wrong in society, and possibly with myself. Gunfighter Nation is a encyclopedic chronicle. It's a third volume. Look at how thick this thing is. This thing is huge, okay? It's a third volume in a series, okay, about the Western warrior culture, starting from the founding of America on to, it was written in 1993, and there have been a couple of guys who have updated it. There's one... a fellow wrote a book called The End of Victory Culture in 2007, which kind of updated it for Iraq. And I can't remember his name, but I've got it coming in Amazon. But anyway, the Gunfighter Nation, it is a chronicle of every single one of these tropes in warrior fiction. We would call it Pulp Fiction, because, and I want to explain this before I go any further, because you and I have talked about this before, but some of our readers might not know. The Pulp Fiction writers, they wrote in the Pulp Fiction venue in the 20s and 30s. When the TV came out, they migrated to Hollywood. So a lot of them were writing for TV shows. They wrote all the TV westerns, and a lot of them were writing for movies. And then, now you have the video games, and, well, it's just a lot of that heritage is gone. But this book explains, it really goes into depth. What are these tropes? what are the common themes that you see? And of course, it is written from an extremely, extremely far left Marxist perspective, and it demonizes a lot of this stuff, and it doesn't really explain why these themes take place. They just present them and say, well, aren't these themes bad? But what's very interesting is, in the book, I can tell you, in the beginning of the book, okay, here are his acknowledgments. Are you ready? I began researching this book more than 20 years ago, and over the years have benefited from the advice and criticism of more colleagues and friends and students than I readily list. And then he goes on and says, parts of the study were completed with the aid of grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the summer stipend from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Okay. And then at the end of the book, he tells you what his goal is of writing this entire series, which he began in 1973 while Vietnam was still being waged. And the first volume is a lot less bitter and traumatic than the last volume is, the last volume of which I'm holding in my hand. And I want to just read you the final page that he says why he wrote this book. Very, very funny. If we wish to contest or alter the myth ideology produced for us by mass culture industries and exploited by corporate and political leadership, and here he's talking about the warrior mythology of the Western warrior in America, and more broadly in Great Britain too, he covers that. The full repertoire of cultural and political responses is still available to us. The cultures of media company boardrooms and political bureaucracies are dependent on and blunderingly responsive to the shifting moods and preferences of the population they both exploit and serve. We ourselves can agitate and organize, enlist or resign, and speak, write, or criticize old stories and tell new ones. If the corporate structure of mass culture excludes us, other bases and sites of action remain, and here's a particularly pertinent point: the classroom, the congregation, the caucus, the movement, the street corner, the factory gate. So he says it. He says right at the end, this is my battle plan to destroy the Western warrior heritage in its mythology. This is what he did. This is the whole point of writing this book. And I mean, you know, it's very clear. I'm 25 years old. I've grown up. What's that?
Not.
You're not. You're 26. Okay. But when I was young, I was really little, and I grown up in a law enforcement family, and many of my mentors have been in the military. The big thing was the war on terror when I was little in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I remember being really little. There was so much. You had all the patriotism, and you had all of like the lionization of these warrior ethos. And this goes back to that original article I talked about that was written in 2003. It really captures the mood. And this kind of thing was just really mainstream. And then all of a sudden, as the war started to go off the rails, this thing was not mainstream anymore, and it was no longer sexy, and it went from being this World War II style John Wayne on the Sands of Iwo Jima, kind of cultural milieu that I remember distinctly growing up in, to this Vietnam apocalypse now. Things have gone off the rails. We don't want to think about it. And then, and then everybody just forgot about it. With the election of 2008, everybody forgot, and warrior culture is gone. It's gone, and it's not coming back, and that's it in society. So there is most definitely an attempt to, and not a very successful one at that, to make sure, hey, we're not going to get this stuff out there. This is not going to be a cultural movement, because we don't want people doing these kinds of things, because it's very, very naughty, shall we say.
It's a way for the system to blame its tool.
Right.
For bad outcomes. That's the perpetual state of the warrior that's in service to any entity that's larger than his tribe or his clan. Is that eventually he is the tool of power, is going to end up being blamed for whatever's been done, according to the will of the powers that control him. That's a pretty common fate. there was, you reminded me of two things. One is something that qualifies as Pulp Fiction. It is subtitled or dubbed, I forget. It's called Sephora 21. It's about these 21 Sikhs who died to the last man defending the British Empire, okay, and defending India. And there's even scenes where they argue with other Sikhs. And the Sikhs are like, why are you fighting for the British? And the one Sikh that's a sepoy in the British Army says, well, these Afghans are going to come and kill our families. They're not just going to come and kill the British. And where are the British? They pulled most of their people off of the line. It's around 1900, and it's really well done. But you know that these guys all die in the end. You know, and right. It was, and it's. I thought it was very cool. The other thing is our perspective on Vietnam is very coastal and very urban and suburban. There's not much of a voice from the rural guys that were involved in it. And one thing I found out living in the Rocky Mountain range, those with some guys that were Vietnam age. In the East, where I was a kid, most of the parents were in agreement that, you know, our kids shouldn't be getting killed in this dirty war, you know, in this little country that we didn't know existed on the other side of the planet. Okay? Because they had uncles, you know, the parents of these kids had uncles that had been to Korea. Okay. Right. So they didn't want that. They knew it wasn't going to be World War II. Now, but this was the guys in that I know in the Rocky Mountains who were of age to enlist when the Vietnam War was still going on. The old World War II guys in the Rockies, all of those guys, unlike the East Coast, most of the guys I know in the East, they all fought in Europe. The guys in the West, they fought in the Pacific. The old men from World War II who had fought in the Pacific, as soon as they heard Vietnam was kicking off, they told everybody they knew, do not get involved in this. Because this is something, they had been involved in a lot of this type of stuff in those types of environments in World War II. And they told their nephews and their sons and their grandsons, you know, do not get in the military while this war is going on in Southeast Asia, the United States. You know, military things are not going to go well if it's fighting in one of these places. The subtext was, it was bad enough fighting the Japs when the indigenous people were helping you. That was nasty enough. Okay. But to go and fight the indigenous people while they were getting help from other global actors like the Soviets and the Chinese, you know, it was just a no-brainer. It's just going to be ugly. And that type of environment, fighting against the indigenous people, is just going to be horrible. And it happened in the Spanish-American War. There were a lot of letters home to parents from young soldiers in the Philippines that were so heartbreaking about how dirty and dishonorable the war became, largely because of the environment. That one, I sent you the link to that one book, The Walls of Jolo, that I read that my father had, about a guy that was caught behind enemy lines in Mindanao in like 1901 or 1902. There's just something about that tropical environment. Part of it's the terrain, part of it's the indigenous people, the things that this causes that doesn't seem to gel well psychologically with like the European fighting man. It just seems to somehow devolve into some kind of nightmare. And I don't know what it is, but if you look at World War II guys from the Pacific, and this isn't the same with Korea. Like the guys in Korea, none of them liked it. They all thought it was a crappy deal, okay? But it was more like what you got out of the guys that fought in Europe in the two wars. It wasn't the same as Vietnam and the Philippines and the Pacific theater in World War II. There was just something about the rainforest environment that didn't seem to be good for the mental health of the American fighting man. You know, whatever it was. I don't know what it was, but it's a common thing that I've gotten from all of these guys, including a couple of guys that liked it. I worked with a guy that later worked on oil rigs and bought a family in the Philippines and basically became like their master.
I read that story in your
He
Trojan
loved
horse.
it.
That was a great story.
Yeah, he loved it. It was great for him. He's like, but most of the guys just couldn't handle it. And he intimidated that something about that environment that really appealed to him, like being a king. He felt like he was a king there, either a tiger or a king. It didn't appeal to most of the other American guys that he served with. So maybe it's as simple as just, being in an alien ecological habitat. I don't know.
Well, I think that's very interesting that you say that because, we've talked about this before. Some of your readers might not remember, but I'll continue talking about it for a long time. I call it the confrontational warrior culture versus the predatory warrior culture. In Europe, if you go all the way back and you read a lot about the ancient Germanics, if you read about them in Germania, the Strategicon, and this is a topic you've gone back much further into time than I have on it, and I really look forward to seeing your work whenever it comes out, is that these guys have a warrior culture where they like to fight up front. They like to fight. It's kind of like the old, introduction to Gunsmoke. You see Matt Dillon walk out, the other guy walks out, and the other end of the street, white hat, black hat, they shoot out, and that's the end of it. Whereas you see in non-really European warrior cultures, many of them, particularly in the Middle East and particularly in Asia, you see them being what I call predatory. And these guys like to do the stab in the back stuff, the sneaky stuff. There's not a lot of sense of mano a mano honor going on. They like wasting prisoners and torturing them. And there's a bizarre spiritual significance for them.
It works better in that rainforest environment. I guess that's what happens here.
Well, and that was the conclusion that I came to in writing my book about Iraq and the Middle East, a book called All Men Follow the Strong Man, was that this warrior culture developed because they're in the desert and there's only a few oases out there. And, these guys, there's not really a lot of room for extra baggage of material or human, shall we say. So this really just leads to this fetishization of torture and just, hey, listen, I'm on top, you're on the bottom. I call it shooting fish in a barrel. In a confrontational warrior culture, you shoot fish in a barrel. People would say, well, that's pathetic. The fish can't shoot back. In a predatory warrior culture, you shoot fish in a barrel. Everybody says, wow, that's so awesome. Look at you, a giant man with your gun and these pathetic little fish swimming around. Wow, you just wasted that fish. That's awesome. And you see that a lot. I talked about in All Men Follow the Strong Man, and it was only in one chapter that kind of preface what we're talking about. If you look at the way that Lawrence of Arabia talks about a lot of the behavior of the Arabs he was fighting alongside and the Turks he was fighting against in the desert, and then you go and you read Edgar Rice Burroughs writing as John Carter, his account of the green six-armed Thark aliens of Barsoom, the planet Mars, you see a lot of the same behavior. And when you look at Edgar Rice Burroughs' biography of what did he do in his life, what were his experiences that led him to write this, he had fought Apaches in Arizona. And I used to live in Arizona, and that's a really nasty terrain if you do not have air conditioning in a nice house. I'm going to be honest with you. There's a lot of nasty stuff out there. It's really hot. People say it's a dry heat, but when it's 110, 115 degrees, you might as well just stick your head in an oven. Dry heat, wet heat doesn't matter anymore. So, you see and there's a particular scene where Lawrence of Arabia talks about how all these Arabs are laughing whenever they're torturing somebody or they're getting tortured and they're laughing. Really weird. And then you also see, if you've read The Princess of Mars about John Carter by Edgar Rice Burroughs, he talks about the only time the six-armed green Thark aliens laugh is when they're doing torture or somebody's being tortured. And, there's this element there, and you see that a lot. You read that in Phillip Caputo's Rumor of War, and you read that in any Pacific wartime story. You got this Asiatic foe, and they do some really disgusting stuff. And it's funny that in the World War II stories, there is still this element of, okay, this morally justifies us wiping this jungle out and, getting all the dirty, rotten Japs, if you're John Wayne. But then in Vietnam, it becomes, oh, yeah, we're going to have a wink and a nod towards the Viet Cong, killing your buddy and torturing him, and all the Vietnamese civilians too. That's okay, but, oh, you might have shot the wrong guy. Well, that's a big no-no. You can't do that. And there's a really bizarre, you can tell as he writes this book, A Rumor of War, he's really struggling with, how is this not factoring into the equation that what the Viet Cong were doing was really, really nasty? How is that not factoring into the equation to explain our psychological state and why we were not happy over there? And it never does, because it really kills the whole narrative of, East Coast, West Coast students waving their Viet Cong Ho Chi Minh flags on the campus, and they were wonderful freedom fighters. And we live in a much better world now that those people run it. But, that's a part of the story that does not get talked about. And let me tell you something. I learned that part of the story when I was 16 years old. I worked with Middle Eastern refugees when I lived in Tucson, Arizona. This was in 2011, so it was way before the hashtag Save the Refugees. It's way before the refugees were trendy. And I worked there with them, and they had Somalians and Turkish and Afghans and Iraqis and Egyptians. And you read, when you don't read, they tell you about what these guys like Al-Qaeda do to people and their family members. I had a guy, he was a Coptic Christian, and he showed me Al Jazeera video footage of his best friend getting ran over by an armored car, getting killed. And he showed me this, and his 9-year-old kid sitting there, and I'm thinking, should the 9-year-old kid be watching this? And then he goes to tell me how the 9-year-old kid can't sleep in his own room, even in America, because he's worried that anytime he hears a loud noise, it's the Muslim Brotherhood coming after him. Because he'd go to school, and he'd go to the playgrounds, and over the loudspeakers all over the place, because it's a third world country, they got loudspeakers, it's kill the infidel, kill the infidel, kill the infidel. And that's what these people were dealing with on a daily basis. You read stories like Shake Hands with the Devil by Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian commander of the UN mission in Rwanda in 1994. And you've got these different rebel factions of Hutu and Tutsi, and they're coming in to negotiate with him, and they've still got the blood of the people that they have murdered with machetes on their shirts. It's not even dry. And they're going to negotiate with him, and the United Nations says, well, God forbid you can't shoot at these people because they had a bad time under colonialism, so it's not their fault that they're killing 900,000 of their own people. That's okay. And there's a real sense of frustration. And in the Pulp Fiction stories, you don't have that. Whether it's John Carter or Conan the Barbarian, maybe they're representing a movement, maybe they're not. I mean, they just go wreak holy hell on all of these bad guys. And there's no apology for it whatsoever. And it's very clear, the sorcerers and Conan are evil. They're doing nasty, weird stuff. Blasphemy beyond comprehension. How many times has Robert Howard said that? And, John Carter in Edgar Rice Burroughs' books, it's extremely set piece and explained, and who's good and who's bad. There's not really very much apology for that in any of the old fiction. And for me, reading it and meeting all these different people and meeting many of the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, that moral framework made a lot more sense to me than anything that contemporary society had to offer. And I thought, well, if it makes more sense to me, maybe it would make more sense to other people and could help them get along in a very, very nasty, nasty world we live in. So this was my entire intention as I dug deeper over the years. Why did I enjoy this stuff? What was it about? And so we come to this realization, and here we are at the website Pulp Fiction Renaissance, which is the culmination of all of these experiences.
The third world Pulp Fiction. Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan. It's like 20 novels set in Africa. Mm-hmm. And he has local friends. It's in a lot of ways very anti-colonial, the way it's written. But there's that aspect of him protecting and avenging natives from other natives,
right?
That are the enemies. And the most a much starker one would be Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane character. Mm-hmm. Half of his stories are set in Africa. And he's wandering around in Africa, and he spends a good deal of time protecting, and this was the same thing in the Tarzan stories, because this was a real thing. And it's shown in a very good movie with Cornel Wilde called The Naked Prey from the 1960s.
I think I've heard of that.
In East Africa, you have Arabs preying upon African Americans and putting them into the slave trade, coming and, killing and chaining them up and walking them off. So the Solomon Kane character and the Tarzan character spend a lot of time fighting against the Arabic trafficking in Africans. just like Gordon of Khartoum did.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my next thing.
And Cornell Wilde's The Naked Prey, he is a big game hunter, and he's there with this disgusting Belgian guy who's just killing more animals than they can butcher. And the guy is rude to the local warrior tribe, who Cornell Wilde's character, who lives there with them, he has an understanding with them. And he says, we're supposed to give them a gift because we're hunting on their land. And the guy's like, well, you know, I'm basically, he pulled the colonial card. I'm a European, they're third world scumbags. And then they come and they attack the hunting caravan. They just straight out kill all the Africans that work for the caravan because they're members of a different tribe. Then they capture the 3 white men. The rude one, they torture horrifically. The other guy, they give to the women to torture. But Cornell Wilde, since they respected him, they had him drink some blood, and then they stripped him naked and they made him run. And the 10 strongest warriors in the tribe were basically going on a lion hunt after him. So this is his story being chased. Naked prey. Right. He's being chased across Tanzania by these 10 guys. And even at the end of the movie, they show every actor amongst the group that were hunting him, and they basically hold them up as a hero too. Like this guy, you know, the actor that played this guy. And you finally got to learn the names of these guys because they were all speaking in their African dialect. There was no subtitles. They weren't speaking broken English or anything. It was all in their language. Cornell Wilde spoke in Swahili to these guys. Okay, so it was a very well done movie. And if you see that movie, that's basically like Solomon Kane or Tarzan from Pulp Fiction, or what Chinese Gordon was doing in Khartoum, essentially trying to prevent what's still going on now, which just actors lobby about, where you have these animist and Christian Africans are just being abducted and enslaved and killed by these Arab Muslims. You know, so that's a very Pulp Fiction movie.
That is.
Right.
You know, and it's funny because I seem to recall in a lot of your writings from a couple years ago, and I haven't seen this, you had a lot of friends who were, I can't remember if they were Nigerian Christians or Ghanese Christians or both, that were cab drivers. And they would factor a lot into your reporting. Were they Nigerian?
Yeah. It was 11 guys, and I knew the one of them well. And he was he was the senior guy. So they all pulled their money. You know, they're clearing out of Nigeria because they're getting wiped out by the Muslims. And they pulled their money, and he got the best cab route because he was the senior man. He was the oldest man. The other guys all moved to Chicago and Detroit to work there because they were much safer than Baltimore. So if you gives you an idea what Baltimore is like.
Right, exactly.
Okay, but I also, there was a guy named Mobilaji who rented a room. Him and his daughter rented 2 rooms from a girlfriend of mine. And I got a lot of stories from him too. And he was an Uber and Lyft driver. Okay, so these were the 2 Nigerian guys that I was, and Mobilaji had been an engineer in Nigeria. I got him a job as a helper for an HVAC mechanic. Okay, and then he worked as a Lyft and Uber driver. I don't know what he's doing now. There's Nigerians have been moving into Baltimore a lot. There's a picture. You know what? I've got to send you the picture from my phone. A friend of mine in New Jersey bought me a pith helmet. I have a pith helmet. I didn't take it west with me because it was too big for my backpack. And if I strapped it on top of my backpack, it would hit like the doorway because it's a big rucksack. But when I'm in the East and I go to Baltimore, I wear my pith helmet because I'm there in the summer anyhow. I took a picture of me in my pith helmet. It's a selfie in front of the Nigerian Igbo Men's Christian Community Center on Hamilton Avenue and Northern Parkway in Baltimore City back in June. So I have to send you that picture. Maybe you can use that. It's It's on my. I did it with my Obama phone here.
Oh boy, that's going to be a very, very quality picture.
Okay, right. So I don't know if there's anything you could do with it, but that I do actually walk around Baltimore City and Baltimore County when I'm there in a pit helmet.
That is phenomenal.
Okay. Well, you know, it works really good. It has like it's got underneath the knob on the top. First of all, it's like a light styrofoam or wood structure with canvas over it. There's a suspension straps on it, and the little knob that you see on top, that's a ventilation system. It's this bush hat I'm wearing now because I got the light on and I don't have my eye patch on, so I can't tolerate the light on my eye. So this is my writing and reading hat. But the this bush hat is it's one of the ones that's got the place for the maps in the top of it.
Yeah.
Even when you take the maps out, you know, because I always want to travel with my maps and my bush hat. Even when you take those out, this thing is much hotter than the pith helmet. Your head does not get hot in 100 degrees sun when you have that pith helmet on. It's amazing. So I wear it now because of utility. At first, it was basically just a guy gave it to me, so I promised I'd wear it on safari. And that, you know, the only African nation I had access to was Baltimore City, so I wore it there. Okay, you know, so at first I just did it like as a joke. I was like, wow, not only is everybody walking way out around me and leaving me alone, but it's comfortable and it keeps my head from overheat.
Well, you know, I guess old Michael Caine in Zulu did know something then when he was wearing that sun helmet, huh?
It was a very practical. It's a very practical thing, and it would save you from a brick. It wouldn't. It would be done. Okay, it would get destroyed. Okay, but if you got hit in the head with a brick or a stick or a bat or something, it would keep you from getting killed. You'd probably still get a scalp laceration, but you know, even a hat helps. So, you know.
And that was a lot of the weaponry they were going up against when that was the warrior fashion of choice.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that, you know, there's a lot of things here. The first thing is, you know, you talk about the movie The Naked Prey, and that's what a lot of what the movie Zulu was like with Michael Caine, made in 1965. You know, it's very difficult to find it on just about any streaming services. The movie is castigated as being so racist and terrible. But the movie, yeah, difficult.
He speaks the local language. He does, and they do. He used local actors.
Yeah, he did.
They used native music.
Right.
And every one of these guys that hunted him was actually portrayed at one as a human. Okay. They had arguments with each other about stuff, as brave, also as sometimes frightened, which means they're courageous because they're overcoming their fear. And in the end, they're all shown, they get their individual still photo with the name of the character and the actor, in case you didn't know the name of the character, because they're saying it to each other in Swahili. It was like when that perfect cusp, right before you get to everything third world is good and everything European is bad, and you've gotten away from, okay, these people weren't even human. But in Zulu, at the end, the Zulu Impi leader salutes the garrison. They had honor. They had a shared honor culture with their enemy, a culture which they did not share with the people that supposedly uphold their status as like third world children.
Exactly. And, you know, that's the thing that people will say, you know, Pulp Fiction, the mythology, you know, it's a terrible thing. It leads to all sorts of oppression. And really, it's the real reason we fought World War II and nonsense of that nature. But it allows for bonding between different groups. When you've got a group of guys, maybe they're in Africa, maybe they're in Asia, maybe they're in the Middle East, they live a really harsh, tough existence, okay? A predator-prey type of existence. They got to do what they got to do to survive. When they see somebody that's a Westerner who, you know, understands that and is from a warrior culture of their own, you see them having a good relationship with them, versus when you see them interacting with a Westerner that's like, oh, you've been so mistreated, you've been so oppressed, you've been this and you've been that. At best, they see that Westerner as a cash cow. At worst, they just don't do anything positive with that Westerner, shall we say. So for me, you look at the way this ethos is, it brings about a lot of, if I dare say, reconciliation and harmony, which sounds really bizarre, but it really does. It really does. When you look at, some of you brought up Chinese Gordon. He's one of my favorites. Chinese Gordon, and then Lord Kitchener, who was, he mentored and then went and finished what Chinese Gordon started. Many people do not realize that Chinese Gordon, if they even know who he is at all, they probably don't. You have to explain to them that he was not Chinese. That was his nickname he got, fighting in China against a warlord who thought he was Jesus' younger brother and slayed 1 million some odd people. And then he fought and reinstalled the rightful Chinese emperor on his throne. That's how Chinese Gordon got his nickname, Chinese Gordon. Okay, so that's number one. Then you get to, why was he down in the Sudan? Well, you had al-Mahdi, the leader of the Mahdist movement. It was a proto-ISIS movement. And they murdered 8 million people. 8 million people. I mean, that is on Holocaust, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler levels of evil. And Chinese Gordon was going to stop it. His government betrayed him and didn't send him the backup he needed on time. And then Lord Kitchener if you read his story in a great book by John Pollock called Kitchener, Architect of Victory, Artisan of Peace, Lord Kitchener, he was willing to take a lot of pay cuts and endangering his career in order to formulate and ultimately enact his 10-year plan to reconquer the Sudan and defeat the Mahdist movement, which he ultimately got to do. And you had Lord Kitchener, and he was in charge of the army that went down there, and you had white British Christians, and you had Arab, Muslim, Egyptians, and you had black Sudanese Arab animists, all fighting together against this evil movement. Now, that's a good thing. I think that anybody along the political spectrum, conservative, libertarian, progressive, Lafondian, whatever you are, Bronze Age pervert, Iron Age pervert, I don't know. I think most people would agree that's a good thing. So when I talk about Pulp Fiction, or when I talk about colonialism or the history of the British Empire or the American Empire, that is what those words mean to me. That's encapsulated in that Chinese Gordon and Lord Kitchener kind of story. And who wouldn't like that?
He got his name fighting. He was one of the 2 leaders of the ever victorious army that mostly used river gunboats, and he served with former Confederates during the Taiping Rebellion. Something like 15 to 20 million people died during that thing.
Yeah.
So it was, it's something that people might want to read up on, but this guy basically cut his teeth fighting in a war that had genocidal levels of death before he showed up, and was instrumental in trying to bring a lot of the killing to a close. And he literally, I thought he was well depicted by Charlton Heston in the movie.
Oh, he did a great job. He did a great job.
He was an eccentric guy that was basically, was sacrificing himself just to shame his government and to helping these other people out. So that was, I would probably say he would be the best argument for colonialism, and the people in the British government were probably one of the worst arguments for it, but they were all part of the same system, and he was fighting against, the bad aspects of, his idea was, if you're going to go and extract resources from these places, you need to protect the people. You're not just going to go make a business deal with them. So what he was fighting against has really taken hold. Essentially, most resource extraction is done by private companies, supported by local tyrants, and colonial troops have nothing to do with it. They only go in when things go wrong.
A lot of in the Western world, they'd figured out, why do we need to fight these genocidal mofos when we can just work with them? And that's a really, really terrible thing. I mean, really, that's the reason why we allowed, Nasser in Egypt to do his thing and the Algerian terrorists in the 60s to do their thing. And, it's really, I mean, you look at the state of Middle East and Africa, and that's why we allow them to do all their nonsense. I think it's very funny, though, that what works back then works today. You talked about Nigeria, and everybody who follows it knows Boko Haram is the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and they kill all the Nigerian Christians and many Nigerian Muslims as well. You will probably remember in 2014 when that was a really, really hot news story, and there was that whole hashtag Save Our Girls campaign where the Boko Haram had kidnapped 200 girls. That did absolutely nothing for them, but what was not reported was that a while later they called in some contractors with some C-130 gunships. And what you saw John Wayne do in the Green Berets with his C-130 gunship, that's what they did. And they solved this Boko Haram problem. Now, what is bizarre to me is that was not reported. It was not lionized, even though it was the only thing that did, quote, hashtag Save Our Girls. But the whole hashtag Save Our Girls campaign was this whole big thing that everybody should get on board this bandwagon, and it did absolutely nothing to help any of those girls or any of those people in Nigeria. And it's a really bizarre thing. It goes to show that the people running these shows are really not operating in good faith, to put it mildly.
It makes a lot of sense because the people who did that promotion, that did do something useful to them. It made the people who do nothing at home feel good.
Right.
Okay, about participating in pity and relieve them of the burden of any guilt that they might have felt about some unwashed rapist with an AK-47 getting hit by a 37 millimeter cannon round. So yeah, that was a perfect op right there. I mean, it's our society. The reason why Pulp Fiction is something that's been done away with systematically is because it's heroic fiction, and heroic fiction really depends on realistic depictions of many things and an understanding of reality to pull it off. And our society is not about reality. It's about a preserving an operational delusion.
Right. 100%. That's 100% what it is. And it's why, they come down on so hard on anybody trying to pull back the curtain. I learned this lesson very early on when I was homeschooled, and I was in a national homeschool speech and debate league called the National Christian Forensics and Communication Association. And to the level that I reached, we traveled all up and down the Eastern Seaboard. Guys who got higher in the organization traveled all over the country. And the reason I did not get higher in the organization was because what we're talking about now was what I was talking about nonstop. And a lot of my fellow debaters and kids, they loved it. They thought it was great. I mean, we had a thing back then, the rules of the game that we would do. Well, first of all, let me just set the scene, okay? You want to talk about a social experiment? You are always talking about science fiction social experiments. I want you to set the scene, okay? You take a bunch of evangelical kids and you put them all in suits and you lock them in a building for 3 days. And you give them a minimal amount of sleep. You're debating from 7 a.m. in the morning to midnight in many cases. And you have the parents of the kids running the organization, okay? And that is a social experiment, and you do that every 2 weeks, okay? It is really bizarre, and some really bizarre things happen. So I was in there, and we had this deal where they called it fiat power, was the rules of the game. If you could propose a plan to debate, even if there was no chance of it ever being accepted in the real world, okay? And you can have a lot of fun with that. So my first year, the topic of debate was the United Nations, okay? And you can do anything related to the United Nations, doesn't have to have a chance of happening. So I said, here's what I'm going to do. we're going to make a United Nations army, okay? And it's going to be led by Americans and British officers and NCOs, and there's going to be 200,000 guys, and it's going to be essentially Lord Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army recreated. And everywhere where there's dictators and terrorists, we're going to go in, and we are going to wipe the floor with all of them, and we're going to end all the genocide. And the let me tell you, the organization was not pleased with what I was talking about. Not pleased at all. But the kids loved it. You know, and the last time I ever did, I had one of the other guys who was debating against me. He's like, I'm on your side, man. I can barely debate against you. He said, if this was a real organization, I'd join right now. I want to take my AR-15 and I want to start slaying these guys committing genocide in your great United Nations army. I called it Stryker Blue Force was the name of it. And so you could see that it motivated a lot of young people, but you could also see that the older folks did not want that being done. And it was very, very sad. And it made me realize at the first time in my life, okay, people don't want to solve the problem and they don't want to improve anything. They just want to keep the status quo going and get their little piece of it.
Well, it's not a problem from the point of view of certain people. For instance, if you have a genocide going on in Africa, and you end up having an argument with the Chinese about them damming the Nile and putting Egypt out of business, and they sink one of your invincible carriers, and there's a huge outcry because 5,000 Americans went to the bottom of the Indian Ocean, then you're going to have to decommission those carriers and turn them into refugee boats, okay, that will load up on the west coast of Africa and come to New Jersey and New York and anywhere, Norfolk, and start transferring millions of people from this genocide zone to the United States. And we've seen how much traction the government could get out of a virus, right? Okay.
Exactly.
I wouldn't use the term. I call it the dread minus, but you know, out of a virus, the government can gain a lot of control out of that. Imagine how much control the government will gain when the machete virus hits.
Right.
Okay. When people were just found dead all over the place, and this virus has caused like a split in their forehead that looks like it could have been made by a machete, but of course, you know, it wasn't, you know, and the government's going to have to, I don't know, you're going to have to wear a yellow helmet along with your mask. I don't know.
Right.
So I think personally, my crackpot view of things is that people in charge want things to be really messed up and genocidal in the third world because that encourages immigration of lower earning people to this country, so it could be used to depress wages and could be used to displace people that make too many demands as far as freedoms and stuff. So if you could replace people like us with people who are just glad not to be getting lined up and shot against a wall, those people are going to be more likely to, you know, go along with a lot of draconian rules by the government. So, you know, so if you were the people in charge, why would you want to go to Africa to save these people when you could just invite them here? Immigration from Africa is way up on the East Coast right now, by the way, and I don't blame those people. The people I met from Africa were really escaping something that wasn't too nice, you know, and they were nice.
Put it mildly.
Yeah, and they were nice people, you know. So, right. You know, so I don't see why you'd want to save them. Actually, I read Machete Season about the Rwanda episode where the guy interviewed the men that did it. It was his second book. He's a French guy. Now, the Canadians showed up at a hospital. The Canadians could have stopped the whole thing right there. These guys were so terrified of the Canadians, they were like the gods of war. But the Canadians were only interested in taking the two white nurses out of this hospital. It was a maternity hospital. The Canadians roll up in their armored cars with their chain guns. All the guys with the machetes stand down. The Canadians take out the two white ladies and then they leave. And then the guys with the machetes kill every woman and child and infant in that hospital. And the Canadians knew exactly what was going to happen. Okay.
And what's interesting is, you know, the reason that they're not allowing those Canadians to start blowing the heads off of all of these machete wielders is because that would be colonial and racist.
Yeah,
and
it would be
that.
It would be evil.
I mean, you see the banality of these arguments. That's absolutely bizarre.
The guys that did it, okay, these were not warriors and they weren't rebels. The guys that did most of the killing, they killed like 800,000 people in what, 10 weeks or something?
Yeah.
They were banana farmers. And they just went out and they treated people like they were bunches of bananas. And their whole life revolved around sitting around drinking banana beer. Well, they spent 14 hours a day killing, okay? I tried to get, they used machetes. I got a machete of the type that they used, and I tried to clear a half acre of maple saplings with a sweatshirt and jeans on in July in the heat to try to, and at the time I was fighting competitively. Okay. I could spar full contact for a couple hours. Okay. Yeah, that was with a sleeveless shirt and shorts on, but I was trying to replicate, you know, the additional African heat. I was good for like an hour with this machete. These guys did this for 14 hours a day, but they were not warriors. They were not fighting. You could have probably sent, you know, a couple hundred Zulus in there with assegais and hide shields, and they could have stopped it. You could have set a platoon of French Foreign Legionnaires from 200 years ago. They could have stopped it. A bunch of cops from New York City could have probably stopped it. They did not see themselves as fighting men at all. They were not raging a war. They were literally murdering their neighbors who they knew because the religious men on the radio had told them to do it. Okay. And the politicians had told them to do it. And they were getting sheet metal and beef because the people they were killing were the people that had the cattle. And these guys didn't get, these were the poor banana farmers. So these guys got to eat meat and they got to collect sheet metal, which they could take to get some American dollars so that they could do whatever they do with their American dollars. And as soon as some armed elements of a Congolese force showed up, and these guys were like irregulars that were fighting in the Congo against some post-Zaire Republic, government. A couple of these guys show up with AKs and they all go home. As soon as a couple guys with guns show up, they go home. Okay, because they're not even fighting men. That they ended up being good murderers of people that were hiding in the mud. Okay, that was it. You know, so this wasn't even a war. This was actually a passive, basically a passive genocide where people just hid, and then when they were found, they just got killed, and nobody fought anybody. It was just a slaughter with machetes. But they did in 10 weeks. They outdid the Third Reich by such leaps and bounds. It's incredible. Okay, with all the trains and the gas chambers and machine guns and everything that the Third Reich had, it took them a year to equal the numbers that these guys with machetes were able to post in 10 weeks. Okay, so it's just incredible what a lack of heroism does. There was nobody there to fight. Nobody, not even one minister that would stand up with a shotgun and rally some guys around him and say, we're going to stand. We're not going to let this happen. Nobody fought. So people who were actually not even qualified to be combatants in their own mind in any type of a fight were able to kill more people than what we're told is the greatest evil war engine in human history. Okay. By like 1,000% as far as work rate. Yeah, it was just incredible. So when people are not fighting and resisting and they're not practicing, nobody's practicing any form of, heroism, which would be resistance against overwhelming odds, then this is what you get.
This is 100% what you get.
It was totally hushed in the news.
Well, and you know what's wild is you had a lot of humanitarians after Rwanda really making a career out of how bad Rwanda is. We can never let it happen again. And one of those most famous ones was Samantha Powers. And she came out with a memoir, I believe it was last year, might have been the year before, called The Education of an Idealist. And her name would always come up when we were in speech and debate because she had wrote a book about Rwanda called The Problem from Hell in 2000, because she was supposedly there as a journalist and got to see it, and it was really bad. Okay. And so her big thing was she wanted to get the United Nations to adopt the responsibility to protect doctrine, or they called the R2P, because, you know, big words are too hard for people to say. But they wanted to get the R2P doctrine done. And so that was going to, if there was a genocide, the United Nations had a responsibility to protect them. So they were going to go send some peacekeepers, okay? The Bush administration tried to get her on board with the Iraq war in 2003 because she had written a lot about, you know, she didn't like Saddam gassing the Kurds. And she said, well, you know, I don't really want to be a part of that because I don't think we should act without the United Nations approval and all this. And, you know, so then you get into Iraq and you had the same thing going on where, you know, they're keeping the U.S. soldiers on the bases and they get to go out to maybe to respond to some mortaring or an RPG attack, but they don't really get to do a lot of offensive stuff because they're worried about force protection. So meanwhile, you've got the Shia militias going in and they're machine gunning everybody in the hospital beds. And you got the Sunni militias doing the same thing. And you have people like Samantha Powers, and many have cut from her cloth, saying, well, you know, we don't want to inflame the situation by sending troops in there because, you know, that could make us look like colonial occupiers, and we're telling the government of Iraq how to police their own borders and even all this stuff. And you saw the same thing. And when Samantha Power became what did she become? The representative of the United Nations under the previous two administrations. And it was the same story with Syria. You know, okay, we're not going to do anything about Assad. We're going to let it get worse because we're going to go through the United Nations channel. And, you know, it's the same story. So like you said, what do you have? You have all these refugees come over because they don't want to be gassed to death or shoved in the torture chamber. Who does? And it's really a mess, you know, and a lot of these guys that I knew, they did not want to be in the United States. They wanted to go home. One guy I knew, his dad would watch videos and look at pictures of their house in Iraq, and he'd tell him, Dad, it's gone. We're not going back. They want to just go back home. And you had a lot of these guys. So, you know, you move them into the United States and you move them into Europe. And what happens? You know, you're from these Middle Eastern countries. I mean, I've moved all over the country myself. A little kid moves around the country. It's always tough. You leave your friends, you leave your familiar surroundings. You take that and you multiply it by about 100,000. You're moving from a war zone. You're going to a completely foreign culture with a completely foreign language. And so what do? You go to the mosque because you want a little piece of home, and you've got the mosque controlled by, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood, whoever, and they're saying, hey, these guys are bad. Go plant some pipe bombs. And you see this, you know, the perpetual cycle just continue to go on. And it's a very terrible thing that I don't understand how a lot of people can sleep at night. I guess that's why they're all alcoholics at the top and are taking prescription pills that could allow themselves to do this. I mean, I met two guys, okay? One of them I went to a thing at a library. It was a talk by a 94-year-old German Africa Corps soldier. He gave a talk. It was really interesting. His dad fought in World War I. He fought in World War II. He was more pro-British because he spent some of his formative years in England. But he fought in the Africa Corps. He got captured, and him and his dad ended up being in the same POW camp in America. Really interesting guy. So me and my family went to go see this guy talk. But what was really interesting was one of the members of the audience, and he had worked for, I don't remember if it was the State Department or USAID or something. And he was the kind of progressive Bernie bro beta male that you would expect. You know, the guy's like got some red hair, but he's losing it, and he's not shaving, and he looks just like hell. I mean, he looks just, his eyes are dead. And so we start talking to him, okay? We're talking to him, and he's like, yeah, I would spend some time in West Africa, and I spent some time in the Middle East, and, it's like, we could never solve any of those problems over there. I thought I was going to do something good, and, it's just unsolvable. These people, they're okay, and you could tell this guy had went and he had bought all of this mythology we tell ourselves. We're just going to give them some foreign aid or some understanding or whatever, and these, Age of Aquarius children are going to stop macheting each other, and you could tell it didn't work. And he had just become a soulless human being. Another guy I met at a coffee shop down the street, me and a friend of mine were talking about these topics, and this guy overheard us, and it's the exact same story, looked the exact same. This guy was a shell of a man, okay? You could tell he had lost his soul, and it was so sad to see. And you see people, and I knew a lot of guys. I grew up with a lot of guys like this, whether they were in the Christian community, the homeschool community, or in the political community. They want to help people, okay? They have good hearts. They don't want to see Rwanda happen, so they plug in to the system of being a humanitarian or whatever, okay? But the system fails them, and you see that and you think, wow, you wasted so much time. You wasted years of your life, and you dedicated yourself to a cause that did not want to solve the problem you cared about in the first place. It's a very, very sad thing to see. And, that's why you have to have things like Pulp Fiction to keep you from going down that route, to understanding what is reality and how do we interpret reality. You see all these things. This was a big theme in The Rumor of War by Phillip Caputo, and you see it in a lot of other books, and you talk to a lot of other people. They go overseas or they go into the ghetto or what have you. They see these horrible things, and their old mental model, their old moral mental model for processing right and wrong and good and bad, it just goes out the window, and they don't have one, and they're lost and they're adrift. That's a sad thing to see. But Pulp Fiction really provides you with a moral mental model to understand these things. And when I found your literature, all of your writings, your nonfiction writings about the situation in Baltimore, and then your fiction writings, it was pretty clear that you have that moral mental framework, and that's why you haven't completely lost your mind like a lot of people do.
Only I don't want to save Rwanda. I'm perfectly okay with. I'm perfectly okay with every one of those people killing every one of those people. But the good news is, as far as the return of heroism is, when you try to save Iraq and you try to save Syria and you try to save Nigeria and everything, you bring it here.
Right.
So that's why in 2015 I wrote the short novel Skulker Jones. It's based like 30 years from now. And you now have Sharia militias with AK-47s on the streets in Baltimore City and everything. And you're going to have numerous machete seasons here. I mean, what better, if you think about classic pulp characters where you've got a European with a sword fighting off a mob of savages who have scimitars. Well, you're not going to be allowed to have a gun because those rights are pretty much just about gone now. That's going to be continually codified. So you're going to have some kind of hand weapon. And you better have a safety hat on. Probably the yellow construction safety hat will be the pith helmet of the future in post-apocalyptic.
It's a very Soylent Green thing to wear.
Right. Machete virus America. Okay. And you'll be fighting a bunch of savages that have machetes. A friend of mine was in New York, and he showed me, he was in a hardware store, and they broke open it's a shipper display. It's a cardboard box displayed. Somebody unfolds, they put on a force somewhere. In the middle of New York City, somebody in this hardware store put up a shipper display of all these machetes. This is like an ammo crate full of machetes. It's like, who's using machetes in New York City? I mean, I was there. I didn't see a tree that wasn't like encased in wrought iron, This is in Manhattan. You got this machete display. So this is great because your dead-eyed acquaintance. He's either going to have to become a Rwandan person huddled up in the mud, or he's going to have to become like the old Africa Gore guy and actually do something. So I think this is going to be really good. We're going to get to actually rebuild. Because I'm a barbarism advocate, so I see I see my stock rising. I'm feeling pretty good. I'm sorry about you civilization people, but
to all the children on Reddit looking to invest, James Lafond's stock is on the rise.
Invest in barbarism, So I think we're going to have real stories, more and more real stories happening. People are going to have more and more real experience. I mean, all the people in this country that have recently been involved in violence that didn't happen, okay, that wasn't covered on the news. Like entire communities have been attacked and wiped out and displaced, and it never happened. Okay, so those guys are living a reality that's in opposition to what they're told is reality on the news. So I think this blows open a window of people who more and more are going to have real experiences that are in opposition with the collective delusion, and they'll fall through the cracks, and we'll get readers.
I think so. And you know what, James? I'll tell you, I call it pulling back the perimeter. If we pull back the perimeter from Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and Rwanda, as we have done, and now the perimeter is here, a lot of people have got to touch the fire to see that it's hot. You can tell them it's hot all day, but they got to touch it. And then, you've touched it now. What we're saying is no longer so crazy. I agree with you 100%. I agree with you 100% because, you've got to, it really is. You talk about the old State Department guy, and he is like John Agar in the Sands of Iwo Jima. He's the loser, okay? And you got to have John Wayne. You got to have John Wayne say, look, man, we're on the Sands of Iwo Jima. You got to get your act together or you're not going to make it. This is what we got to do. And so here we are. And I think that is a good thing. I'm a Christian. And, the Bible says in Genesis, Joseph says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. He can use all things for good. And maybe he can even bring, the West back to some sense of heroism because, like you said, all of a sudden you need it. It's kind of like when cleaning supplies, you need cleaning supplies. All of a sudden they're being sold. Oh, wow, now you need machetes. There's machetes everywhere. It shows you what the need is.
Got a full tang machete. Now, I do have an idea for the Pulp Fiction site. I've actually got two ideas.
Let's hear
There's something I used to do called reader versus writer.
Okay.
Where readers would write in, and I would have 48 hours to produce a story, okay, on their single line supposition. So one guy wrote in, he said, what if Fred Reed's mind and soul were trapped in Maureen Dowd's body? I want you to write that story. One guy wrote in, I want you to write a story about Bigfoot, but he's got to be a millionaire. So I titled that Love Stinks. There was one guy wrote in, he said, I want you to write a story about Batman running into two thugs in Baltimore City. And he actually requested a sequel. I ended up doing a sequel to that. So if you could figure out some mechanism where like somebody could like make a pledge to your site or something like that to help with defray the expenses, okay, I would be willing to write their story. Okay, it would have to be short. You want to do you could put up like this is what a vignette gets you. This is what a short story gets you. If you want Lafond to write your short novel, you better be cute and deliver the script idea in person to his camper. And
you're right.
Okay. But I would be willing to do that. I had a lot of fun doing that. There's a couple of collections of short stories I wrote that came from that experiment. That was kind of fun. And the other thing is, since you're a young Christian man with a law enforcement background,
not mine, but family.
Well, in your family, right. In your family,
there will be no stolen valor here.
Right, I'm an old heathen man, okay, who has had an animosity for the police for most of my life, and have been harassed by the police on numerous occasions. And I find myself sympathetic to criminals in many cases. Okay, a lot of it was my Stockholm syndrome from spending 4 years interviewing criminals about stabbing, getting stabbed, and watching stabbings.
You are the ghetto grocer Patty Hearst.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest, because I read some of your fiction and I like your pacing and everything, I'm going to suggest, dare you, sir, even, to do a biopic pulp adventure with me, where we each use a character that's based on us. You know, your character's 25. Okay, his dad was a cop, but now he's a cop, so that's the difference. He's a cop. My difference is I'm a criminal. Okay, and your character.
She's not in real life, dear viewers. I want to throw out.
All right, so your character, that's you, except he's a cop, arrests my character, who's me, except I'm a criminal. Okay, and it's in a dystopian near future where you're one of the only cops that's not crooked out there, and of course the other criminals all want to kill me because they figure you're going to pump me for information. Where we now will have to survive my arrest as a team, okay, so that you could get me to the point of my justice, where justice is going to be served to my reprehensible old heathen ass. Okay, so maybe I could be like a neo-pagan cult leader. So I don't care. I'd like to have you pick like what kind of scum. Am I a drug dealer? I'll be fine with being a drug dealer. If you want me to be like the David Koresh of the future, I'll be the David Koresh of the future. Only please don't, please make me an Odinist, and not an Abrahamic.
Of course, so, in the true spirit of James Lafond's Sons of Arius project.
Okay, so I thought that would be fun if you're up to it. I know I'm putting you on the spot here. Okay, if you'd be up to doing that, I'd like to be your co-author, like where you would write a chapter and I would write a chapter, and I'll write the first chapter. About waking up and getting arrested with this, this prick with a crew cut, like kneeling on my chest while, I'm between Shanika and Alicia in my crib. and the bitches are still snoring. They didn't even wake up for this, So, I mean, I'd be willing to kick it off and write the first, the first chapter, and then we could hand it off. Like I write a chapter, you write a chapter, back and forth. I'd like to write the first chapter because I want you to write the last chapter.
I think that would be great. I like that idea a lot. I'll tell you, if you read what I wrote, I haven't written any fiction in, it's been 7.5 years, almost 8.
Good. So you haven't imbibed all those literary tropes that you were supposed to suck in to be the next Steinbeck.
Exactly.
So that's good.
That's why I stopped writing. So that's I'll tell you, I'd like to get my knife a little sharp before I embark on an expansive project like that. But I love the idea, because the idea, I think it is both of our fantasies come to life. You being the great crime lord, and me being the great John Wayne, man on the white horse in a Soylent Green type of society, and we live it out together. I think that's a great idea.
You'll be an evangelical Christian in an America that's run by the Chinese, okay, where Christianity is going to be outlawed, at least proselytizing. So the only people that you could witness to would be the people that you arrest, because there's not going to be like a bunch of human rights and, you don't have to talk to me until you get, so the whole Miranda thing is going to be suspended under Chinese corporate rule. So I would, as a criminal that you've arrested for the Chi-Coms, I would literally be the only person you would be able to preach the gospel to without getting in trouble with your employers.
Wow, I like that idea. And I'll tell you why I like that idea. I have always wanted a Mao suit. so I could cast myself wearing one. I thought it was really cool when Sean Connery wears the Mao suit in 007. I like Mao suits. I think that's a really good story because, you know,
do it is corporate. Okay, so don't make it like Chinese government control. There's Chinese corporations that have devolved the Chinese control because the American scumbag corporations have slowly sold off their interest to the Chinese rulers. So it's not going to be like this conquest of the American by the Chinese or anything. It would just be like the infotech guys handing off their stock shares to the Chinks.
I like that idea. I like that idea a lot. I like that idea, and I think you could. Now, see, I'll tell you the truth. In fiction, I really like the idea of, you know, the good guys going up against some manner of cult. And I was always a big fan of E. Robert Howard because of that. He's always going up against some evil cultish sorcerer, okay? Maybe we could work some element of that in there. I like that idea a lot.
Hey, we could still, I don't use his real name, and I believe he's probably trying to angle for upload, okay? So he could become our celestial god and orbit us with his satellites, okay? And probably his brain will probably be housed in Philip K. Dick's body on the dark side of the moon, okay? But for the head sorcerer that's still pulling all the strings, even though the Chinese managers, corporate guys are running things for him, I would say if we granted Brill Yates, if we granted Brill Yates and his wife
guest appearance
and his wife Brillinda Yates, if we granted them life extension therapy, and they're now like really old, but they're still around and they're still trying to angle for upload because, you know, the technology just hasn't gotten to the point where he could like put his brain up into this database, then he could be like the lead cult guy. He would be literally like the ancient sorcerer or priestess that even the Chinese would be afraid of. Of course, you would call them the Chinese corporations or the triads or whatever. Me, as the heathen, I would be calling them the Chinks. You know, it's going to be one of my crimes. Maybe you arrest me because it was legal for me to sell drugs, but I went ahead and I called somebody a Chink, you know?
Well, and you know, if you live with me, my favorite term to refer to the regime in that part of the world is the Chi-Coms. Okay, so, you know, I arrest you for calling them that, but I'm referring to them as Chi-Coms. You're like, what the heck can you say that? Well, look at this badge right here. I can say that. You know, I'd also like to, I think it would be a good idea, too, if you could work some manner of human trafficking from Eastern Europe so then I could end up with some kind of hot Slavic chick. I think that'd be a really good idea.
Well, that's my foot warmer at the bottom of my bed while you arrest me. Okay.
I like what this is. We're linking it together. I like it.
So there you go, man. So, you know, one of the babes that I'm with, you know, maybe the one that wakes up when you kick in the door. You know, and I think, you know, it's going to be more like a Blade Runner setting where things are so corrupt, you can't show up with a SWAT team because you can't trust half these guys. And you really want to make sure that they don't just execute me right there. Okay. So you're coming in, your style will be individual arrest because while you're processing the paperwork, you've had too many occasions where the guy you arrested and you were taking to court got shot in the back of the head, behind the office, you know, by your coworkers or whatever. So, you know, it could, we could throw something like that in there. You know, you don't execute prisoners. So you start doing arrests on your own, you know.
I like that.
And,
I like that idea. I think that is a really good. I mean, look at what I'm wearing. Look at what you're wearing. The story just writes itself, doesn't it? I mean,
hey, this is my Sunday. I dressed up for you, dude.
Wow.
The church lady, the secretary at the church, saw me wearing the same sweatshirt 4 weeks in a row. Okay, and it has like paint and oil stains on it and stuff. So she actually took me out shopping and she bought me this and she gave me this bandana because everything I had was urban camo or industrial camo. Okay. And I used to keep my keep my aged chicken neck warm, because I don't have enough of a gnome beard to actually keep my neck warm. And I don't like running the propane heater out here because it's too noisy. So anyhow, this is dressed up, man.
I like this, man. And you got a collar and everything. What I really like, and what you call the Dread Minus. Oh, look at that. Freshly shaved. Wow.
Well,
That is nice.
Shaved it yesterday, but so this is the attire. It keeps the head warm, keeps the sun out. Well, my little artificial sun here out of my bad eye, so I don't use lateral light. I write under this vertical light. But yeah, I would definitely like to, we could write each other because we're also getting to know each other. This is the first time we've had a face-to-face conversation.
This is.
So I'm probably going to write my first chapter, like tomorrow or something like that. Okay.
And see where it goes, man. You know what? The best thing about writing fiction, and this is something I'll say, I have had I have always let other people's opinions get in the way of my fiction, unfortunately. But whenever I have written fiction that I really loved, you've just got to have fun with it and just kind of see what happens. And I think that would be a lot of fun.
I have an idea that maybe the lady at Reader's Digest would be happy with. We've got 2 viewpoint protagonists. So I'm suggesting 2 flat character arcs where my crusty old ass isn't going to change and you're not going to compromise your beliefs. But in case you wanted to please one of the ladies, you could maybe rehabilitate the criminal Eastern European babe that's keeping my feet warm at night, who, her entire job description with me has been the engagement in various non-Christian acts. Okay. Her skill set does not go beyond, like pickpocketing, distracting the security guard while I'm clearing out, lying to cops, and whatever horrible things she does for me in private. And she's also in charge of beating the shit out of my other chicks. Okay. So I think this character you could actually have a transformative sidekick character.
I like this idea.
Okay. We'll have to name her. Okay. Come up with an Eastern European name that you want to use for.
You know what? Okay. I'll tell you. You know what? Just a nod to Dr. No. Jam Slider. It works for me.
Jam Slider?
Okay. What's like honey? Jam. What rhymes with rider? Slider. That's just what I came up with.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Makes no sense.
We could say that her real name was Svetlana, and I renamed her Jam Slider. Okay.
I like that.
And then
I like that.
You could work on. You'll successfully rehabilitate this chick.
Of course. Because look at me, James. How could I not successfully rehabilitate a chick like that? Come on.
So you're going to. Okay. So that's good. That's good. And it's and eventually my character might even give you my blessing. Once she loses her criminal edge, she's not going to have much appeal to my character. Okay.
Of course.
Okay, so this could be good. This could be good. So we have a little.
I like that idea.
James Bond element in there. Okay.
I like that idea. You're like a really, really twisted Q to my 007, but I like it.
Only the world is so rotten. Okay.
Right.
You're actually trying to save the villain from it. Okay. While you.
I like it.
Justice. Okay.
I like it. I like it a lot. I think that's a great idea. What's more fun than that? And you know what? I'll tell you what. Every writing circle that I ever joined, which was usually 90%, again, of a certain gender demographic, which you can properly figure out which one it was, they just never wanted to do fun things like that. Part of the writing process, you throwing ideas off each other. You're just having fun. And I think that's what we've got going on here. I think we're doing it. Oh. And I look forward to doing more of it.
So for the short, I'm trying to think of a way where you can get paid for all the work you're going to be doing. So I'm not going to be doing any work. I write more stuff than my editor. She's sitting on 59 books right now, and I'm probably going to spend.
You're a good influence on me. I need to put a lot of this stuff down on paper and just shoot it out like a fire hose, like you do. You're a machine at producing.
So, So yeah, I was only supposed to do like a book and a half a month, and I did 3 books in January. So now uh, what I'd be willing to do to support the site, to make this a going concern, so you could devote all your economic energy to to Pulp Fiction. I want you to be the next Farnsworth Wright.
He was a very neat guy, wasn't he?
Figure out whether you want to do Patreon or Subscribe Star to support the site,
Okay.
and just say the membership. Just put membership levels, okay, for vignette, short story, okay, and we could do short novel and limit it to 7 chapters, okay, for 3
I like
different
that
levels.
idea. I like that idea.
That's the
I've
Robert
always,
E. Howard. The classic
yeah.
Robert E. Howard short novel is 7 chapters. So I'll do like a Robert E. Howard short novel for somebody. They've got to come up with, if it's a vignette, their description's got to be 1 sentence. If it's a short story, the description is 2 sentences. If it's a short novel, the description is 3 sentences for the whole thing. And then I'll write it and I'll kick it right out easily, because for me, the mental energy is burnt coming up with a story idea. Okay. And then the rest of it's just really easy.
Okay.
And then that's what somebody will get for, let's say, being a supporter at this level or that level. Just come up with the levels and structure it. And I don't mind, because I'll twist the story to my liking anyhow. Like when this one guy one guy was a white nationalist, wrote in about Astride the Chariot of Night. He's like, yeah, that was great. It's nice to see a guy that looks like me as a hero, but he only killed like 3 brothers, and he like wiped out like 25 white guys. I don't really feel good about that, man. It's like, I'd like to see something where, where he's just like, I was like, okay, bro, okay, I know. I think I've known dudes like you. I had a friend that was a platform member of BASH, Baltimore area skinheads. I said, how about this? It's a story. It's a hero story. A band of brothers, the 7 baddest dudes on the planet, and they all look like you. Okay, and they're fighting the whole mudslide. It's like, African, Mexican, Catholics, just like coming out of the woodwork, like rats after Willard, like roaches. They're fighting like massive armies. It's going to look like a 1950s, Chuck Heston movie, like 52 Days in Beijing. How about it? He's like, yeah, man, yeah, I'm all about it. I said, okay, well, there's a catch, because you just got the genie out of the bottle and you asked them for sure. I said, they're going to be the last 7 guys that look like you on the whole planet. Yes, they're going to be the 7 baddest guys on the planet, but they're the last of you. He's like, oh man. I'm like, oh yeah.
So you know what that means? That means they've got to get with the chicks of the enemies that they kill, and guys like that aren't a big fan of that now, are they?
So it turned out to actually be a trilogy. It was Reverend Chandler. Then, in order to write, people asked me for I was like, you kidding? I decided in the end not to kill the wimpiest guy. Okay. I mean, there was a little bit
for you is a very big deal.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't kill all 7 of them. I only killed 6 of them. I'm like, really, I don't want to have to write a sequel. And people were asking me for a sequel. So I had to write a prequel from the point of view of the Catholic Crusaders of my twisted future. Okay. That these neo-Nordic American Indian guys were battling against, basically a bunch of white Indians that want to be Vikings, were the guys in Reverend Chandler. So Malediction Song was a prequel about, the Maledictine Creed. Okay. The guys that totally, once the Vatican's taken over as part of the Caliphate, there's a sect of Catholic crusaders that come up in post-apocalyptic America. Okay. So these are literally the enemies. So I eventually wrote, I wrote it this time last year. I eventually wrote the 3rd one, Night Song of the Nords, which has another title, Eye of the Dictor. The Dictor is the head of the Maledictine order. Okay. And the Nords are the surviving, there's a couple of surviving neo-pagans up in the Pacific Northwest. And what I did is I wrote it, one's from the point of view of the heathens, and the other, and the next chapter is from the point of view of the dictator, who's basically replaced the Pope. He's like this he's like a cybernetic Warhammer Pope. Okay.
That was just what I was about to say. That sounds a lot like Warhammer.
Right.
That sounds
right.
a lot like Warhammer. So you have a little bit of experience playing with this, Christian straight-laced hero and pagan straight-laced hero saddling up together. This is a theme that you've dealt with before then.
I wrote Prentice Dolphin is about a apprentice in a future monastic order that are in, and he's in charge of just since there's not many priests, he's in charge of acting like a deacon, taking over the priest duties, and he's the caretaker for the sacred relics. It's set in, I think, 2300 North Carolina during an ice age, in which a crusading order, and it's a different crusading order. It's a different version of the other idea that I did differently. And his name is Prentice Dolphin, and he gets ahead of himself, and he ends up declaring a crusade.
Uh-oh.
Okay, which he kind of did it impulsively because he was being hazed by the justices. So there's the prentices and the justices on the frontier. The justices are the knights. So there's this old crusader named Justice Claret, who actually they have the justices have this thing where before they go out and in the 1300s there was a glacier that was about to eat a town in the French Alps. So the Catholic priests went out there and prayed at the glacier to try to get it to stop from eating the town. So I have this in this future setting. The prentice's job is to go out with the justices and pray before the glacier to try to convince God to stop the ice from coming down and wiping out what's left of their civilization. So he's just inherited. He was the assistant. He was the acolyte of the prentice before him, who just perished. So he's now he's ready to leave the cathedral to go out to pray at the glacier, and they have this thing they do. The first time they get one of these sissy prentices out of the church, the justices, who are the Crusader Knights, they like to haze him. Okay, and his two assistants, his acolyte and the other guy, they both panic and they run. But he's convinced he's going to die. Okay, but he stands there anyhow and prays. So he gets their respect, and it goes to his head immediately, and he basically preaches a crusade right there against the glacier. So Prentice Dolphin is about this guy that's a bookworm going out with these 26 savage badasses that have been fighting the heathens and the barbarians in the mountains of North Carolina during this ice age, like 300 years from now. And now he's going out on crusade with them against the glacier, because it's a post-technological setting where these people have basically lost their technology.
Yeah, because I was going to say, are these guys wearing like medieval times get-ups and using swords and whatnot? Okay.
Yeah, there's a reason that that is in the subtext that you eventually come to find out, like 10 chapters in. I gave this to you for the website too.
I remember that, yeah.
About 10 chapters in, you'll kind of begin to find out why the technology devolved and why they're basically just capable of medieval levels of technology, and they still have remnant older technology that they don't know how to use. Okay. Right. So, and he was educated down in Savannah at where the head of the order is. It's a big monastery, and he's at this cathedral out in the hills of North Carolina. And basically what they're trying to do is see if they can find a mountain pass that takes them to what used to be Tennessee, because Justice Claret is convinced that not all the heathens are dead, that there's still some more out there. Okay, now the Prentice
made it through the Tora Bora Mountains, kind of a story.
Yeah, the Prentice still just wants to stop the ice, but Justice Claret is, the guy's been a crusader for 50 years. His sword's a little thirsty. So
I like that idea.
Okay,
I really like that idea.
For the website to put up,
because in my from the very short piece that I sent you from a piece that's a little bit longer. These guys were in space, but they're all using 1930s weapons, and they don't ever aim. They're always shooting from the hip because, in all the great movies, everybody's shooting from the hip. That's what you see a lot of in mine. One of my favorite techniques that I like to use in writing, and I want to see what you think of this, because this guy is your hero. And I've only read one of your books. Okay, so I've read Tomorrow and Is You Sure, the children's stories. So I've got these other ones on my docket. And so they weren't really two fantasy settings. So they weren't really super, they weren't really kind of an indicator of what you like to do. But I think one of the greatest things that E. Robert Howard did was that if he ever wanted to evoke a certain, the look and the feel and the milieu of a historic time period or people, he'd use names that were kind of like him. So I believe in It's the Story of the People of the Black Circle, the one I'm reading now. He wants it to be in a mythical Indian and Afghan border. So he gives all the civilized people Indian names, and he gives all the barbarians Afghan-sounding names. Yeah. And that's I did that a lot in my fiction, and it's a technique I like to use because immediately, when you're writing fiction, you're really dealing in the realm of the subconscious, okay? And something that I've been practicing since we had started talking about this website, I've been sharpening my knife. And the big thing that would always get me was character descriptions. I love to write character descriptions. I like to do them. The hardest part for me, and it could be because I was so excited about doing it, is writing the character description of the hero. And that's always very tough to do. I feel like E. Robert Howard wasn't even the best at doing character descriptions of the hero. I think he was the best at doing character descriptions of everybody else. The best I've ever seen for character descriptions of the hero, it wasn't even Edgar Rice Burroughs, but it is Walt Coburn, who wrote a lot of Western stories. And they have his papers at the Arizona State University in Phoenix. And the other guy would be, what was it? He went under the pseudonym Loring Brent. He wrote a series called Peter the Brazen, and another series called Singapore Sammy. And one of the covers for Singapore Sammy is on the homepage of our website. His real name was George F. Warts, I believe, but his pseudonym was Loring Brent. So what is your take on writing character descriptions, and particularly character descriptions of the hero?
There's two ways that Robert E. Howard alternated with. And it's the reason why the Conan character and the Solomon Kane characters are so powerful, and they were adopted for comic books, because the artifice is really strong. So he uses, Conan's always got long black hair,
right?
Okay, that's confined by some kind of band, which is like a diadem. And he's always got a loincloth and sandals. Edgar Rice Burroughs does the same thing with Tarzan. The Solomon Kane character has his distinctive buckled hat and his coat and his big wide belt. He's got his rapier and he's got his guns. And he's got his juju staff, which turns out to be the staff of Solomon, okay, in the stories, which he does not know that, okay. But the mechanically how Howard does this, and Edgar Rice Burroughs did it as well, is it's generally there's an opening scene that frames the artifice of the character for you. And the Conan and the Jewels of Gwalior starts out with the scene of him climbing and what this guy looks like from a distance. Okay, so there'll be a narrative scene. For instance, the very first narrative scene, Howard's writing about how Conan had a troubled brow. He was a brooding character, and he tread the gleaming kingdoms of